Greetings. Welcome to the No Lies Radio. Will the 2020 election be stolen? Election Integrity Panel. I'm Jeremy Rothkushel. I will be your host and moderator for today. It is October 25th, 2020, and the implications of our moment could not rise to a higher level of intensity. And thus, in the midst of all of that, we are very pleased to bring you, on behalf of Alan Rees, the producer here, bringing all of this together at No Lies Radio, an incredible panel with really prescient expertise. I believe all of them to be coming at this from a different angle, but all, and they can push back on this if this is an unfair description, but principled pragmatists all around here. And so I would like to briefly introduce our panel and then run down through our schedule. And if you have questions, I will lay out how you will do that towards the end of this panel. All right, so we are very pleased to be joined by Jennifer Cohn. Jennifer Cohn is an election integrity advocate, writer, and freelance journalist whose election integrity articles have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Who, What, Why, TYT Investigates, the Brad blog, and Salon. Since the 2016 election, she has focused her professional efforts exclusively on investigating and exposing our country's insecure computerized elections, to put it mildly. Next up after that, we will have Benny Smith. Benny Smith is an election commissioner in Shelby County, Tennessee. He's a quantitative analyst who has worked with Bev Harris, uncovered fraction magic, the fractionalized voting, and he has an insider perspective. After that will be Jonathan Simon, the author of Code Red, Computerized Elections and the War on American Democracy, Election 2020 edition. And he was the executive director of the Election Defense Alliance from 2006 to 2016 and has published numerous papers on various aspects of election integrity since 2004. And then finally, Timothy E. Worth is a former congressman and senator from Colorado. Recently, he and a group of similarly concerned citizens have been working to shed light on the potential dangers awaiting us in the 2020 election, as discussed in his Newsweek article, How Trump Could Lose the Election and Still Remain President. And so briefly, I just want to point out that we will be taking questions from the audience. You will find the instructions for that at the bottom of your show page. There are 3 steps. Please go ahead and read through them, and you can submit your question down there. You can do it both in writing, but we would also encourage you to join us in the live stream, and all the instructions are down there. And then additionally, one last thing is, in the case of internet disruptions, censorship, all of these kinds of scenarios, there is a backup link that you should take note of right now, also in the show description there. And so briefly, I just want to point out that I think that our panel here is really going to be coming at this from the crucial angles that we need right now as we head into the last 10 days to this upcoming election. Of course, there are questions on the table about whether what we will know on the day of 11/3 this year, November 3rd, and whether there might be a much longer struggle of some sort. And so that will be touched upon. And so we have 2, I would say, insider perspectives here. Benny Smith coming from the local level in Shelby County, Tennessee, who really, found direct evidence of what is going on in a very discriminatory fashion, especially in relationship to the African-American community there. And then from the insider perspective of inside electoral politics, inside the federal government, we have Senator Worth, who will be talking about the kinds of things that we might need to look at that level. And then we have, I would say, our analyst activist experts of Jennifer Cohn and Jonathan Simon, both serious writers, but also very deeply engaged in understanding of the legal dynamics and the direct electoral process in all of this. So I just want to hand it over to the panel, and we will first have Jennifer Cohn. And the way that this is going to go, we're going to do, again, 20-minute presentations, each speaker. And then right after that, we'll have 10 minutes for the entire panel to discuss, debate, deeper inform questions that come up. And then in the last hour, we will then turn to questions from the audience. Okay. So first up, Jennifer Cohn. She is, as I said, an election integrity advocate and a writer. And since 2016, the 2016 election, she has focused her professional efforts exclusively on investigating and exposing our country's insecure computerized elections. Jennifer graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1989, West Side, LA, and Hastings College of the Law in 1993. She was a law partner at Nielsen, Haley, and Abbott in Marin County for many years, where she specialized in insurance coverage and civil appeals. Before that, she specialized in criminal appellate law. Thank you very much for joining us, Jennifer Cohn.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. As explained by election security expert Hari Hursty, a peaceful transition of power is the core of a democratic society. But unfortunately, peaceful transitions cannot be assumed unless there is enough transparency around the electoral process that not only the winners, but the losers of the election and the supporters of the losers of the election have confidence that the outcome of the election was free and fair. Transparency is also crucial so that the public can provide oversight and demand accountability of election insiders who might possibly be either negligent in exercising their obligations or potentially even corrupt themselves. And I do want to say that I think the vast majority of election officials do a good job, and the same with poll workers. But having a system that is faith-based is a recipe for disaster and a recipe for undermining confidence in election outcomes. So I have decided to focus my talk on transparency. Unfortunately, as I have written about extensively over the past 3.5 years, transparency has proven to be somewhat anathema for both voting machine vendors and, unfortunately, many government and state and county election officials. Not all of them, but for many of them. And some of the media, again, not all of it, but some of the media has been complicit in this and underplaying significant vulnerabilities in our election system. And there are many problems with that, including that it makes it very difficult to affect change because change is work, and it can be a lot of work when you're talking about trying to make changes to an election system. And if you have underplayed or even denied real vulnerabilities in the system, it makes it very difficult or impossible to get traction for those changes. So when I talk about transparency, I mean the ability of members of the public, ordinary citizens, to both understand easily and actually physically observe the processes used to count and even record our votes. And in many Western democracies, they publicly hand count paper ballots, and members of the public often are involved in that process. And as long as this is done in public and not behind closed doors, then that would be an example of a truly transparent election where you don't have the types of doubts that we often see about American elections, about election outcomes. But according to many election experts, and I'd say probably most, our US elections are more complex than they are in many of these Western democracies. And specifically, our ballots are really long and they include a lot of referendums and propositions that you just don't see on the ballots in other countries, at least not to the same extent. And so because of the length of our ballots and the complexity of our ballots, it makes it really difficult to hand count them publicly on election night, at least if you were talking about doing the entire ballot. And I think it could probably be done for federal races and maybe statewide races, but the entire thing, it would be very difficult. And so what we do in the United States is we use machines, and we use a lot of machines. And what comes along with that is a lack of transparency or a vulnerability to a lack of transparency because machines are inherently opaque, you can't see what's happening inside of them, and complex. And the more machines that you add into the system, the more complex and opaque it can become. And with this complexity and opacity creates a danger for potential fraud and undermining trust in the outcome of elections. It also puts members of the public really at the mercy of voting machine suppliers and of government and election officials to tell them when something has gone wrong. And unfortunately, the vendors in particular and many of the officials have proven to be not particularly transparent. So, according to David Scheimer's book called Rigged, which came out probably in the last 6 months to a year, 4 senior members of the Obama administration told him that Russian hackers were in a position where they could have altered vote tallies in at least some places in 2016. But the public was really never alerted to this possibility. In fact, at the time, the only official that I know of who even alluded to this possibility was former Senator Harry Reid, who wrote a letter to James Comey, who was then the director of the FBI, and he published the letter. And the letter said that the threat of Russian interference is more extensive than widely known and may include an intent to falsify election results. According to Scheimer's book, most of the senior members of the Obama administration dismissed Senator Reid's concerns. But there was a crucial caveat that was also noted in Scheimer's book, which is that they could not discount the possibility that vote tallies had been altered. The most they could say is that they hadn't seen it. And so here's a quote from James Clapper, who was Obama's director of national intelligence. And he said, quote, "We saw no evidence of interference in vote tallying, comma, not to say that there wasn't, we just didn't see any evidence." And so that was really the mantra that we have heard about the 2016 election. But also, according to the book Rigged and the many interviews that were taken there, the Department of Homeland Security did not have independent surveillance abilities of our election systems. They had to get permission from state and county election officials. And in most cases, they did not have that permission. I'm not saying they necessarily even asked all county election officials. I'm not really sure who they asked, but they lacked access to monitor most county election systems before the 2016 election. And in fact, in June 2017, the Department of Homeland Security confirmed that it had conducted no forensic analysis of equipment to determine if vote tallies might have been altered in 2016. And it said that it did not intend to do that analysis. So when the Senate Intelligence Committee in, I believe it was 2019, came out with a report repeating that there was no evidence vote tallies had been altered, there was really just one lone dissent, Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, who pointed out dissent is maybe too strong, but he did a whole section of his own comments on the report where he noted that as far as I can tell, there was no systematic post-election forensic examination of the voting equipment. And he said that for whatever reason, whatever the reason for this failure to act, the administration cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of 2016. So it was in 2017, it was Reality Winner, not the US government, that actually leaked the internal NSA report that confirmed that Russia's attack on our infrastructure was actually a lot more pervasive than either the Obama or the Trump administrations had let on. And in fact, several key state officials told the media that until she leaked that report, they had not been told that Russian actors were attacking their systems, and that they considered the leak of the report to actually be an act of public service. But instead, the government locked her up gave her the longest sentence ever under the Espionage Act of 5 years, and she remains in prison even as Trump's cohorts, like Paul Manafort, who gave our polling data to a Russian-connected oligarch before the 2016 election, he's been freed. And Michael Cohen, who arranged payoffs for Stormy Daniels and to rig polling for Trump, he's out free. But Reality Winner remains in prison. James Comey was a lot less transparent than Reality Winner. So in September 2016, as the administration knew that Russia was in a position to change tallies in some places, he testified to Congress that it would be really difficult for hackers to alter the outcome of an election because supposedly voting machines never connect to the internet. But unfortunately, according to actual election security experts like Alex Halderman and Hari Hursty and Andrew Appel and really all of them, this was really misleading, because even if voting machines themselves don't connect, they all have to receive programming before every election from a centralized system, and that computer system or computer, and that computer often itself connects to the internet. And even worse, oftentimes this function is farmed out to third parties, contractors who do the programming for the county. And sometimes they, Rich DeMello, Professor Rich DeMello, who is an expert from Georgia Tech, referenced a conversation he had with some local election officials about the 2016 election, where this programming was actually done on a laptop at a Starbucks. So not a lot of security there. Not only that, but contrary to what Comey and a few others had testified to Congress and led the public very much to believe, some voting systems in 2016, some precinct ballot scanners actually did connect to the internet. They included wireless modems that connect both the scanners and, perhaps more importantly, the county central tabulators to the internet. And those county central tabulators aggregate the precinct totals, and that's where the official vote totals come from. So that is very, very dangerous. And election officials have ignored pleas from experts to remove these modems. There was a letter from 30 very, very respected election security experts sent in September. All of the state election officials ignored it about removing the modems. And they're in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Tennessee, Minnesota, Illinois, maybe not every county, but most counties, certainly in those first three, Wisconsin, Florida, and Michigan, and at least a few in some others. Unfortunately, manual recounts have not proven to be a very effective solution, because they seem to always, well, either the Democratic candidates don't seek them, and when they do, they get blocked. So Trump blocked the 2016 recount. In 2000, the GOP blocked the 2000 recount. Kerry didn't seek one in 2004, etc. And so manual audits were really a reliable paper audit trail was really the big thing that all the experts said we had to have for this election. But unfortunately, just 3 states, Rhode Island, Colorado, and Virginia, passed laws requiring what experts consider to be meaningful manual election audits. They're called risk limiting audits, just those 3 states. And even they are only doing it for a few races. And we have much to worry about, by the way, besides the top of the ticket. We need to worry the whole way down the ticket. We need some kind of transparency for the whole ticket. So there have been a number of other problems as well with voter registration systems and electronic poll books. In 2018, there were problems with voter registration systems in Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Florida. And I found this out, apparently this was reported to the hotlines, but the hotlines, for whatever reason, although they perform a very important function to help voters work through problems at the polls, they do not make their data public, and they do not make their numbers public. And that makes it very difficult for accountability for the public to demand investigations, because the public has no idea what's really going on. In January 2020, the FBI told states that it would find, good news, we're finally going to tell you if breaches occur of local election systems. They hadn't been doing this before, but they absolutely have not committed to telling the public if breaches occur in 2020. And on the contrary, they actually made Florida state election officials sign non-disclosure agreements about breaches that occurred in 2016. So that is not transparent. Which brings me to my optimistic point. There are many not enough, but many election transparency activists in the country, and they have been scrambling, really working themselves to the bone to do what they can to make sure that the types of doubts that many of us still have about the 2016 election do not taint the outcome of the 2020 election, and that there can be some accountability if there are problems, and some confidence in the result. So Scrutineers.org is a really great organization, which is networking and educating volunteers, so voters who are interested in helping to protect this election and bring transparency to this election. I'm a co-founder of a group called Protect Our Votes. We're at protectourvotes.com, and our big election transparency project this November is called Photo Finish, where volunteers are going to go to precincts and photograph the precinct results, which are often posted as for transparency for this very reason outside polling places. And then you can compare those results to whatever comes out at the county tabulator and is reported as the official result later on, and make sure that they match. And again, those are posted for transparency, but until now, really just a few people had been taking advantage of this and conducting that type of comparison. Benny can talk about this. He found it pretty significant, very significant discrepancies in Black precincts in Shelby County, Tennessee, Memphis. And so a lot of, so Protect Our Votes is doing this. We're coordinating quite a bit with another group that's doing this called Democracy Counts, and they're at democracycounts.org. And Transparent Elections North Carolina is doing this poll tape project as well. So another transparency project that I support, I'm not involved in it personally, is the Columbus Institute for Contemporary Journalism has sent out very detailed requests already to every single county in Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona, asking them for details about their election equipment and about who is programming it. So who is programming those ballots at Starbucks, et cetera. And they are preparing to file lawsuits in the places that allow citizens to file, lawsuits. Not everywhere does when it comes to election challenges and election equipment problems, but they're preparing to do that wherever that is allowed. Ballot images are another way to provide some degree of transparency. Many of the scanners in use today automatically create images of paper ballots, whether they're marked by hand, which is the gold standard, or by a touchscreen machine, which many experts have concerns about. But there are images of those ballots, and if we can get them, then citizens can use them can compile them and compare a ballot image totaling to the official reported totaling and look for discrepancies there. And the groups sort of at the forefront of that are Audit USA and Citizens Oversight. I really, really want to alert a lot of people to a great project called csay2020.com. It blew my mind when Benny showed it to me. The guy behind it is Deepak Puri. He has been on NBC News promoting it, but it really needs a bigger shove, because what it does is thank you. This is what it looks like. What it does is voters go to the website, csay2020.com, and if they see problems, they type in what type of problems they are. So like problems with voting machines, or like I mentioned, with voter registration systems, or voter suppression and intimidation. And CSAY they have a team that vets the reports, and then they post them on this map, which, unlike the hotlines, is actually public. And I don't want to diminish the hotlines. 1-866-OUR-VOTE is very important still to get help if you need help or you have questions. But you also need to report to csay2020.com if we want to have any kind of public awareness of the magnitude of problems, and if we want to try to have evidence where we might actually be able to do lawsuits based on these problems or election challenges. csay2020.com is crucial. And finally, I did want to mention the National Voting Rights Task Force, of which I'm also a member. They are working on a project with another group where they're going to be screenshotting county election results as they come in. They have a program that's going to do it every 10 minutes. And the idea is you keep doing this every 10 minutes, and you want to make sure that vote totals never go backwards. They do sometimes go backwards, and that is indicative of a problem. It's something that needs to be investigated. That actually happened in the 2000 presidential election, when 16,000 Gore votes were deducted from Gore's total in Volusia County, and another 4,000 in Brevard County. Those errors were discovered by alert poll workers or officials, or somebody discovered those problems, but we don't know if other problems like that occurred, because again, we didn't get a full manual recount in that election, or really in most any election, except for I think Al Franken got one in his, and it actually overturned an outcome in Al Franken's favor. So again, I just want to say, as we talk about security and we are careening toward this election, I encourage everyone to think about it in terms of transparency, because transparency will both build confidence in the outcome, no matter which way it goes, and it will also help us provide oversight and accountability should problems occur. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer Cohn. I want to open it up to the panel to discuss, but I first want to bring in a question of, do you have any specific ideas? It sounds like you're suggesting how transparency can work towards accountability. So any projections or strategies or thoughts you have projecting forward towards potential problems about how to turn truth into justice?
Absolutely. The poll tapes are sort of this treasure chest of opportunity to try to, it cannot be a check on every aspect of the system, unfortunately. For that, we need full manual recounts or meaningful manual audits, which the GOP, by the way, blocked legislation last year that would have required these meaningful risk limiting audits for all federal races. So we're not going to get that, really. But the poll tapes can at least tell you if those county central tabulators, which are so crucial and to the election system, and they are a centralized potential attack vector, unfortunately, both for hackers, internet hackers, and I hate to say it, but for corrupt insiders. It is a vulnerability. So if you compare precinct totals to those county central tabulator totals and they match, that's good news. And if they don't match, it means that we need to investigate further. And I think this is really a good opportunity. And we have many hundreds of volunteers already at protectourvotes.com. We would like to turn it into many thousands. So you can sign up to help us with that at protectourvotes.com. Photo finishes the project. And some places don't post the poll tapes, by the way, and we need volunteers to help us with that too, because we'll be doing public information requests. So Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, I believe in many and perhaps most places, they will not post their poll tapes, which is unfortunate. Wisconsin has those wireless modems in the county tabulators, by the way. And so yeah, we'll be doing, we need volunteers for that as well. And we even need analysts. We will largely automate this comparison, but when discrepancies do occur, we need human eyes to confirm that the software didn't make a mistake comparing the precinct results and the reported results. So we'll need human eyes, and we need volunteers for that too. So it's a really great project. And honestly, check NVR, National Voting Rights Task Force. I think it's nvrtf.org. But they have this project coming up, and it's great to make sure, again, that vote totals don't go backwards, another red flag. And I believe they will need volunteers to help them, not to do the screenshots. That's going to be automated for the first time this year, which is really exciting because they can do a much greater volume. But they do need volunteers, I believe, to help cut and paste the URLs for all of the county election websites into their system. So check there in a couple days, or even today, but every few days, or my Twitter account at JennyCohn1, JennyCohn1, because I will absolutely be posting about that and other opportunities.
Thank you so much. Want to open it up to the rest of the panel for input, questions, anything.
Jenny, this is Tim Worthat.
Hi.
It was widely reported after the 1984 election that there were extreme difficulties with the voting machines in Ohio, and that was the reason that at one point during the evening, Kerry thought he'd won and then lost. That was never formally challenged. What do you know about that, and why wasn't that challenged? This is the most recent that we know about, egregious example of just what you're talking about.
That was the 2004 election.
Yeah.
So apparently his own campaign suspected electronic tally manipulation in that race, I think both before and after the outcome in Ohio. They were worried about Ohio specifically. And they did go to court before that election and tried to see as what he described the voting machine algorithms. I think he's referring to the software. And the court turned them away because the software is proprietary to the vendors, which is a problem really everywhere. The contracts all specify that the software is proprietary. And so it makes it very difficult to persuade a court to let you look at it. I will say the more that people are aware of vulnerabilities, and that's in the mainstream, that at least it's conceivable something could happen, the more likely it is to try to overcome that hurdle of the proprietary software. But I think what he said is that the 2000 recount was such a mess and divided the country, and that he didn't want to divide the country the same way again, since we were at war in Iraq, and he just felt like for the good of the country, it was best that he not challenge it. I personally think, hindsight, is 2020, and at this point, a whole lot later, I'm not sure that was the right call. At the time, I believe that he had the best interests of the country in mind. It would have been nice, though, if he had at least said a little earlier than he did say, and a little more loudly, that he had concerns about that election, because there were a lot of advocates who for years, have expressed great alarm over that election, and they've really been sidelined by a lot of people and called names and conspiracy theorists and things, and it did them a great disservice, I think.
Yeah, could I just mention that,
Yeah.
that another, having been one of those that was called conspiracy theorists about that election, one of the other aspects that kind of stopped Kerry short was the fact that he lost the popular vote nationally that year by about 3 million votes. Gore in 2000 had actually won the popular vote by 500,000 votes, and it gave him some legs to stand on, both from a legal pursuit standpoint and just also in the court of public opinion. When we looked at 2004, we saw examples of non-competitive states, and states that were safe states like Alaska and New York, where we found forensic evidence that suggested that there might have been vote count manipulation. And that was brought up as by those who were calling us conspiracy theorists as an argument against us. And it's like, well, it just didn't only occur in Ohio and Florida. What about all these other states? And one possibility to consider is that, if you're running a sophisticated election theft operation, one thing you want to keep in mind is what the post-election environment is going to look like. And by taking votes where they can be taken and changing in a presidential election, the popular vote tally, in this case, having Bush be the winner by 3 million votes, really put a major damper on the ability of Kerry or really anybody else to investigate and challenge on his behalf. And the reason I bring that, on his behalf, because after all, he's going to challenge Ohio, but the nation had rejected him by 3 million votes, apparently. So who was he to challenge the people's choice? And the reason I bring that up is that we're looking at something potentially very similar coming up in 2020, where the popular vote, which I think at this point is pretty much conceded Trump is going to lose, but it could, the degree, the magnitude of that popular vote margin could play a role in how much he can step up to challenge that election. And therefore, we really, again, need to look at, we're focusing on battleground states and critical states, but there may be issues throughout this country in the way that we suspect there were in 2004.
Just one quickly, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you. That's all very helpful.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the thing that puzzles me almost more than the fact that he didn't say anything, that he didn't say that he thought his election was stolen or challenge it officially, is why he didn't become an election security advocate himself, or a transparency advocate, and really, really come down hard on these vendors. He could have waited a few years and then done it, but he didn't, which I find puzzling.
I have one maybe a question for you, Jennifer. In terms of the reappearance of Karl Rove and the intensity surrounding Ohio, does this suggest some kind of potential repeat of 2004, where we have the background of the smart tech servers and, of course, the Paul Manafort role in all of that, and Mike Connell? Can you speak to that, and whether there's a local election that's also crucial there?
Oh, I imagine that was one of my followers, because I have been on Twitter, because I've been writing about this a lot recently. So Karl Rove was sued actually for allegedly rigging the 2004 election, and that suit was dismissed after one of the people who so Ohio's results in that election were sort of bizarrely rerouted through a backup server to Tennessee, not Ohio, but to Tennessee. And it was Republican operatives who did this kind of rerouting. So that was one reason why some people were understandably, concerned about, had concerns. about that election. And because of lack of transparency, we never got to really know one way or the other what happened. And that one of the two men who was supposed to be potentially a star witness in the case, his deposition testimony was not star testimony particularly, but there were some people have said he was getting cold feet and he was getting ready to say everything, and who knows, but his plane went down before he could testify. And so that case against Rove didn't go anywhere. So yeah, Rove was also I guess the election that really gets me, and this I'll circle around to the current election, but just very briefly, Don Siegelman, if people have not watched Atticus versus the Architect, I cannot encourage them enough. Despite everything I had read about over the years, I only watched it probably 8 months ago, and it blew my mind, and not in a good way, in a very, very devastating way. But I think it is such important viewing for us to understand what we're dealing with. There's a quote that I kind of like, but it's attributed to Thomas Jefferson. I think it's taking some liberties with his actual wording, but it's that an informed electorate is the best defense against tyranny. It makes sense, and I think people need to read it. So in his election, 6,000 votes were switched from his column to his opponent's column in Alabama. He was Alabama's last Democratic governor, a very, very popular politician. He'd been governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state. He was expected to win re-election. Rove was working on this election. He was buddies with his opponent's campaign manager. 6,000 votes disappeared. Rove's client was the attorney general. They seized the paper ballots, so they actually had them. This is another example where they don't let you look at them even when we have them. And they seized them, and then they threatened to prosecute anyone who tried to get a recount, which is really bizarre. And they prematurely certified the outcome. And Siegelman is really the only former Democratic candidate that I know of who actually says he thinks his election was stolen. And it's actually a very brave thing to do, but the big bad already happened to him. They locked him up. I mean, he pushed back on Rove much harder than most people do. He was going to run again, even though they were threatening, they were threatening to do stuff to him, and they did stuff to him. They locked him up on really trumped up charges that even many Republican prosecutors, 100 prosecutors around the country, said this was a political prosecution and unjust, many Republicans as well. So I'm very worried about Rove in this election. Jennifer Brenner is running for the Ohio Supreme Court, and the chair of the Ohio Democratic Party is sounding the alarm that Karl Rove he isn't talking about electronic theft specifically, but that Karl Rove is working to help defeat her. And Rove has many tricks up his sleeves. It doesn't have to be electronic. And he's really supporting the incumbent, which is her opponent. But this matters so much to gerrymandering. I worry that if we get Trump out, people will be so excited they won't take a look at what happened down ballot. And down ballot matters a lot. So in 2021, they're going to redraw the maps to decide, which will have an enormous influence on the control of the House of Representatives for the next decade. And in Ohio, apparently it will come down largely to the makeup of the Ohio Supreme Court, and this seat is absolutely crucial. Please support Jennifer Brenner. And yes, I'm very worried about Karl Rove's activities there, and I'm very worried that Trump, bizarrely, before the election, is trying to steer a multi-billion-dollar contract to a company where Rove sits on the board, Rove and Peter Thiel and somebody else. And you notice these things, and because we don't have transparency, no, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I am just concerned. Any race that Rove is working on, watch it like a hawk.
Yes.
We need those precinct totals. We need them photographed. Pennsylvania won as well, and not just electronic, by the way. He'll be all over the absentee ballots, challenging stuff. We need observers to make sure they don't throw out, based on bogus challenges, absentee ballots, et cetera.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer Cohn. Now we will move to Benny Smith. Benny Smith is an election commissioner in Shelby County, Tennessee. He is a quantitative analyst who's worked with Bev Harris, uncovered fraction magic, fractionalized voting, and has a deep insider perspective here. Benny Smith, please take it away.
All right. Thank you, guys. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to put a few slides up to give a little context about Shelby County. You guys can let me know when you see the screen. It should be a little bit of a delay, but should come up by now. Is it there now?
I don't see it.
Would the hosts allow me to share?
Alan, will you allow Benny to share his screen?
It's saying that it's sharing.
Oh, okay, maybe it.
There we
it
go.
is.
All right, so just a little bit about it. Shelby County. Shelby County is Memphis is the large block of city boundaries inside of Shelby County. It's a predominantly Democrat town, predominantly African American, and I say 60-40 turnout, and I will just pivot to show just some analysis that I'm working on. This is Shelby County right now, as of about 1 day ago with early voting. And if you want to just get a good primer of what it looks like, there are about 115,000 people who have Democrat histories that have voted in our early voting period. And that's just over 63,000 Republican people with Republican history. So it's no secret it's a Democrat town, but there has been some storied history in Shelby County, and I just want to walk a little bit through it just so that people can see some of the things that have happened in Shelby County. In 2007, the party that was in control of conducting elections in Shelby County was Democrat. Obama ran in 2008, and Tennessee turned real red, and Memphis took a beating. So in 2009, that was when Republicans became the people in charge of conducting elections. And in 2010, 9 Democrats sued, trying to void the entire August election. And there was an account where there were 6,802 more votes cast than there were actual individuals who had participated in the election. So the first election, when the party conducting the election changes over, you got lawsuits everywhere. People are going after the machines. I'm a virtual citizen at this point. Then as time progresses, most elections are happening every 2 years. So 2012, there was a vote of no confidence on the election commission, and this headline probably says it all. It says maybe the commercial appeals should keep this week's headline handy so it could be cut and pasted it for each election cycle. Shelby County election officials say they have corrected voting problems. So then the administrator of elections, he was under fire a lot. The whole election commission got a vote of no confidence. The election administrator who's conducting the elections, he's placed on probation. People are asking for him to be investigated. They're asking for him to be fired. And there are more lawsuits. So there are lawsuits that are happening in Shelby County every year. 2014, like 2010, was when the gamut of local power is under transition. In 2010, it was a complete sweep. Again, it's a Democrat town, Democrat county, but a complete dominant sweep of all of the countywide seats by Republicans. So the Democrats, seemingly having the majority, are still just electing Republicans for their leadership. So in 2014, I came more out front as a citizen. I was always working with candidates. I developed this predictive program to figure out who will walk into the booth and vote. So I'm kind of the political strategist. So I'm really versed in turnout and precincts and elections. But in 2014, we had another slate of candidates that ran, and it featured Judge Joe Brown, who was, he was one of the most notable people. This guy's probably making $20 million a year, living in Los Angeles. He's a television show icon, and he decides he wants to run for local prosecutor in Shelby County. Well, he didn't win that race, and he didn't win that race, and neither one of the other Democrats won it either. So these are just some of the headlines where they are saying gross failure of manipulation, electronic voting machines, disenfranchising Black voters, costing Democrats elections. It's not me thinking this. It's not the candidates. This is literally in the headlines, and they say the 2010 election cycle, they successfully defended every seat in 2014, and if they didn't move one race to a different calendar year, there would have been another sweep of that too. So this is, four solid years of, it's going to be 8 years when you consider that they are the people in power. Complete domination by a Republican Party, and one of these local newspapers was thinking maybe we need to the Democrats need to think about switching parties and going to join the Republican Party. So that's what you normally see when candidates lose. There's some infighting in the party. So along comes a bunch of candidates who come to me, and they, every candidate who loses said that their election was stolen. So I really wasn't buying that. But I did see that we had some really household names that I did think didn't look right, especially with the demographics and me learning, doing the analytics, and seeing the number of people that are turning out. It doesn't represent, a lot of Black people saying they want to get prosecuted by a Republican person, right? When you consider the nature of the Black population when it comes to policing. And then you take somebody like Judge Joe Brown is running for local prosecutor. So it wasn't an anomaly, but again, that's not proof of anything. It's just looks really weird. So I decided when those candidates, they came to me and they say, you got to look at these systems. And I, as a consolation prize, I'm a computer programmer. So I said, I'll take a look at it. I'll see what it looks like. I found some really disturbing stuff when I looked inside of the software, but I decided to bear it out in an experiment, and I decided to conduct an experiment. So in 2015, I conducted this experiment, and I don't think the sound is going to work, so I'm just going to gloss over this particular slide. But it's a video from Bloomberg Business Week, and they just covered and documented the two studies that I was conducting when I was looking at the elections. Nonetheless, when I was inside of the program, I studied the counting mechanism, and that's kind of what I wanted to hone in on a little bit today. If there's time, I'll do a demo so you guys can see it. But Lynn Bernstein of North Carolina, what is her? It's a Transparent Elections NC. She really gave me this slide. So shout out to Lynn Bernstein. And it was a way to try to get people to see how what I discovered actually works. So, and we called it Fraction Magic. Bev Harris of blackboxvoting.org. I did this in concert with her. It was a study that both me and her conducted, and she named it Fraction Magic. As the name would suggest, it's a magic trick, more of a sleight of hand, and you're using decimal places to accomplish that. So that's the fraction and the fraction magic. But if you look at this precinct scanner, the precinct scanner is receiving the individual vote totals, and they are tabulating some aggregate totals for the precinct. But then those are in most places transmitted over this Wi-Fi signal. So if you can see my mouse the way I'm moving, the raw votes totals are then being sent to a central tabulation system. And the system that I'm looking at is the GEMS central tabulator. We still use it in Shelby County. We will vote in November. We are voting now on that technology. But then there's this hidden code that is allowed to run, and it is not a bug inside of the hardware and software. It's an actual feature, and that goes without saying. I think it doesn't get said enough. I don't think people have really caught on, but it's the gift that keeps giving, because every time somebody loses, they come online or into the knowledge of fraction magic. But this hidden code exists here. This framework exists here, and I wrote basically a proof of concept to show that if somebody knew what to do once they got inside of the computer, they could wreak havoc. And I do that in short order. And there, if I have time, I'll do an example. But there are lots of videos of me doing this example. But that code is the central tabulator where I'm attacking, and those are the aggregate totals of the precincts. So now all of this information is getting added up, and then that's sent to a state board of elections, or sometimes sent directly out to what we see in the media. And basically it reallocates those totals based on these this framework. And I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it's a very nasty framework. It's a dirty, filthy framework that completely erodes the notion of one person, one vote. But you guys may, who are watching, may notice this. And I want to read it. It says, "That's strange. I wonder why candidate A's vote totals just went down." And this is a depiction of sometimes people are looking at the totals, and the incomparable Jenny Cohn just talked about this in one of the projects she's working in, where people are trying to get the snapshots to make sure the totals never go the opposite direction. And it's really significant when you consider that if you just capture the totals, because those are the only things that are being committed on election night, that you could actually find problems. And I found one of those problems, and it wasn't fraction magic. I want to be clear in Shelby County. What I discovered the framework of fraction magic looking at Shelby County systems, but this poll tape that I took a picture of, that was something different. And in 2015, I went to a precinct and I used my predictions program, and I basically said, if there's going to be any problems to happen, or if there's any nefarious doings or somebody doing anything wrong, that will have to happen at the precinct level. And I learned that on election night, the precinct totals are the closest thing to the cash register receipt. It's committed on election night. It's prima facie evidence in the statutes of Tennessee, and it would be everywhere else in the U.S. too. But I took a picture. Shout out to BlackBerry. I took my BlackBerry phone out. I still carry a BlackBerry now, by the way. I took my BlackBerry out and I took a picture of this poll tape, and it counted. It said that 548 people participated in the election. Well, when the central tabulator reported the returns, that same precinct, 7701, was then represented as 330 votes. And I'm going to try to zoom in on it. My mouse is kind of going haywire, but you can see right here, that same precinct was represented as 330. And you just cannot do that adding. You can't do that. So there was a candidate who really, she wouldn't let it go. She kept pressing me about her election, and she wanted to go to court, and she was had a treasure trove of things that she saw that was wrong. And I really told her, we fought about it, and I basically said, just throw everything in the garbage but this poll tape. No lawyer would take her case. Her name is Wanda Halbert. She's currently her name is Wanda Halbert, and she said, all right, Benny. And she took this poll tape in the courtroom, and she said, this poll tape shows that 548 people voted. They are only counting 330 of them. They need to explain how this happened. And the judge agreed, and it went to summary judgment. Long story short, Bloomberg Business Week thought that was as about as cut and dry of evidence that you could get in an election. They said it, nobody's ever really had anything that was so provable that you could know that something is wrong. And it was just basically me taking a picture of trying to document the record. She got to summary judgment. Bloomberg, they came and wrote about it. Well, this was October. If you look at this, October 2015. In December of the same year, December the 7th, the media writes that the commissioner, the administrator of elections, decides it's time to retire. So it's not a direct correlation, but it's mighty coincidental that this guy decided, despite everybody trying to have him fired, him getting a no vote of no confidence, glitches, lawsuits over and over, Democrats complaining. It was just the mantra of the day when it came to Shelby County. And he decides to retire. And our state representative, G.A. Hardaway, one of the most vocal critics of the administration, they were calling for him to be fired and investigated. Well, he steps down. 2016, we have our traditional presidential year, but there are no local races on the ballot. So with that, we had 2018 for the next slate. Right? So it was 2010. These same seats came up again in 2014, same seats. And then in 2018, that's when we had the next set of elections. So in 2018, this is what the headlines were. It was a complete Democrat sweep of the countywide offices. Now, I'm in analytics, so I have crunched these numbers over and over again. These were the same voters, guys. These were the same people that for some reason for almost a decade, they would not elect some of the same people that they kicked out. were elected, and some of the people who were always winning were kicked out in 2018. And the only thing that they could say was, it's a new administrator of elections. So that was a monumental task for the county-wide, just geographically, for Democrats to lose for 2 cycles in a row and automatically reverse and take every single seat. Right? It's not like 3 or 4 got through the gate; they completely took every seat. So I wanted to show you some of the candidates. They were featured in MSNBC, and Wanda Halbert's the lady in the red. She was one of the people that sued, and she ran in 2014 and lost. She ran in 2015 and lost, and she ran in 2018 and she won. And she received more votes than she was the second highest vote getter, if you will, of totals on election night, because she was a very popular person. Now, her budget, I think she's over about $975 million in gross revenue in the current seat that she holds. So there's a lot to be understood about elections. There's a lot to gain. They're in many places, they are the largest employers. So you really have some problems. And look, like I got about 5 minutes. I'm gonna see if I can conduct a demo for you guys really quick. I'm just gonna go into it really, really fast, just to show you that that it does work the way that one would think it does. This is the GEMS tabulator, and I'm going to open it up. And I'm going to preview one result, and it's so crazy because I'm going to go against time and steal an election for you guys. So I'm just trying to end my PowerPoint show, and it doesn't want to end. But let me go to the GEMS tabulator. I'm going to bring up one race, and I'll go to that race, and a race against time. I'm going to give somebody a winning hand, just so you can see that it really does work. It's not something that is a farce. It really does make sense. I'm going to pause for just a second so you can see the totals that are there. I'm looking at the gubernatorial race, where these are election returns. I'm not going to go into details, but 38,000 is what the winner has, and Ron Ramsey is third place, and Zach Wamp is in second place. I'm not going to close it. I'm going to open the Fraction Magic tool and run the program against it, take the totals, and I'm going to pick a new winner because I think we need a new winner. So I'll open Fraction Magic, and I won't go. If you guys can see it, it's up here. It's running. I'm just going to put my mouse over it so you can see it, and I'm going to pick a new winner. Looks like I got about 3 minutes, so I'm going to say. I'm going to show you who the winner is going to be. So this black box this is Fraction Magic. This is what I developed with Bev Harris, and I decided that Joe Kirkpatrick is going to get about 46% of everything moving on election night, and the Basil Marsilks guy is going to come in second place. Those are the determinations that I made. So if you look at it, I took the worst 2 people. So Joe Kirkpatrick is in next to last place, and Basil is in last place. Well, write-ins. But I'm going to conduct this quick run through, and I'm just going to butcher an election to show that the totals can work. Again, I got a hidden program that's running, that's doing it, and I will type it now. 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, and 6 seconds. Just note that it's an ethical swap. This will work on my software here, so I'm not doing it on that. I'm doing it in a controlled environment. So I'm going to re-preview these results so you can see that there is a new winner. And that new winner is going to look a lot like what I said. I'm not closing the program. I'm just looking at the results again. And just for everybody to be able to see, it did happen the way that I say it was going to happen. I said he was going to get 40-something%. Joe Kirkpatrick is the winner. He has 43.98%. But the part I want to slow down on, and I think I got about 2 minutes, is look at Joe Kirkpatrick. He has $34,065.58. when we talk about fraction magic, this is very problematic that this application allows this to happen. It doesn't look like we're talking about votes anymore. It looks like we're talking about money, and that is a problem. This is opening these election systems up to very powerful financial allocation models. It does not belong in a system that's supposed to allow one person, one vote. And if you look at the vote total, it says 77,452.25. So I cooked the books a little bit, and I told it to make a mistake. If I was writing a program, it would make a mistake, but I built a mistake in there. And basically, when the totals are around it, I will be off by one vote. And that's so significant because the laws say that you can't challenge an election if it's not enough to upset the outcome. Well, I just completely buried every number in sight, and I was only going to be off by one vote afterwards. So that's a problem. It's something we need to deal with. And I would just put another shameless plug in my last 15 seconds, is the way you mitigate these type of things is with ballot images, scrutineers.org, smartelections.us, Democracy Counts, Protect Our Votes. They are going after these poll tapes. That is the exercise that I thought was good to mitigate the circumstances, and I think everybody else should. And the last place is CSA 2020. CSA is allowing other groups to take poll tapes, and if they have poll tapes, that they can take those pictures and they upload them and they show up on a map. It's stuff a phenomenon. It's a wonderful tool. It's aggregate. It's built on some serious technology. That is something that happened in Shelby County. This is something that happened in Florida. I would encourage everybody to go to CSA 2020 and use this and get the word out. Thank you, guys.
Benny Smith. And as we open it up to the panel, I'd like to ask you, Benny, it appears unavoidable, the disturbing resonance with what you discovered 5 years ago in terms of the fraction, actually the 3/5 fraction in relationship to Black votes in the United States of America. And with your powerful interview with Jennifer Cohn, speaking to the background of that negotiation as having been done by the alleged allies of African Americans, what are the political dynamics in terms of allies and foes politically around what you've exposed here?
So it's a slow, everybody's coming onto it slowly. It's a real big math lesson. Even though the math is simple, the application of it at scale is complex. You know, people say, well, you can't scale wide. You can't have wide scale election fraud. Well, yes, you can, but you don't even need it. You need it in certain areas. And what you'll find is, you know, it's a sport, right? I say politics is a blood sport. It's a sport, but think of any sport that you know that nobody's ever got caught for cheating, right? No players ever got for cheating. I just want to disband the notion. People say that it's voter fraud. It's not voter fraud. Get off the voters. It's election fraud. The voter doesn't want to keep control of $1 billion empire. They don't want to cheat so that you can keep making $200,000 a year and giving your buddy $1 million contract. The way I developed the Fraction Magic program, I asked myself one question. I said, does anybody have an incentive to remain in power? And once I knew the answer was yes, I don't know anybody that says no to that. But once I knew that the answer was yes, I was like, then what would you do to stay in power? And it's like lie, cheat, steal, kill, right? Kill is still on the board. People have died in politics. So it's just something that's incredibly disturbing. People are coming online to it. And the poll tape project, even though I was probably the recent point of origin of taking a picture of a poll tape, it is a great tool to try to mitigate some of this stuff.
Thank you so much. Opening it up to the panel, please. Any comments or questions?
Yeah, I actually have a question, Benny. So I'm not really a math person, and somebody asked me this question: why would somebody go to the trouble of fraction magic as opposed to just flipping votes for like a predetermined outcome? What is the benefit of that particular vote flipping?
You'd get caught so bad and so easy. There, like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. I'll give you an example in Shelby County. There is a white guy, Jewish guy, who is a prominent fixture and he runs in a black congressional district, and he gets reelected every 2 years. You don't know the relationships that people have. There could be a Republican guy who is beloved in the African American community. So you can't just swap votes around. You're not going to make all the black people pick the white Republican or all the white people pick the black Democrat, right? Or the white Democrat. There are too many demographic profiles. And this is the reason why the registration rolls are so important, because you have to know when you can touch that and when you can't. And the way you do that is you look at prior voting history, prior election outcomes to know what you can touch and what you can't. Yeah, you get caught almost immediately.
But I don't see how this prevents you from getting caught, because you're still having an outcome that doesn't make sense for that. I mean, the reported outcome for that precinct is different on the actual.
Right, but you can. With this, if you know that you can't take and give the candidate that you want to win a whole bunch of votes, you can reduce the quantity, or you can transfer those votes to another person. So in the poll tape example that I took a picture of, there was like 7 candidates, but there was one that was be the favorite winner. So what you would do is you would transfer those totals from that person and reduce his quantity and give it to other people. You absolutely get out of the door with that. You can't give it to your guy that you want to win, but you can definitely move. It's a sleight of hand. You can move those totals to someone else. And the reason why decimals are important is because you can't do it without having round off errors. And the best example I give for that is if I say you're going to get 50% of a precinct and 3 votes come in, you never know how many people are going to walk into the booth. If 3 people come in, then that's 1.5 and 1.5. Well, 1.5 rounds up to 2. 1.5 rounds up to 2, you now have 4 votes, and you cannot do that. And that's where you see these explanations of people saying that there were way more votes than voters. I see Senator Timothy looking back. Now, this is why you have this blunt instrument like that. And this was implemented right after the 2000 election. And I think it was Volusia County where they had 16,000 negatives. If you can't give me the totals, it's going to go as far along the number line to make your percentage true, even if it has to subtract 16,000 votes to get there.
I wanted to point out in Georgia, they also had an issue with recently that was reported in the Root of, I think it was 127,000 votes from predominantly African-American polling places vanishing. It was just, they were undervotes, but they were statistically able to eliminate all kinds of other possibilities, and it had nothing to do with ballot design, and it didn't happen with the mail ballots. And Philip Stark, who's a really renowned, probably the most renowned election auditing expert in the country, worked on that, and it was never explained. And it's what's frustrating. I think our media breaking news model is really broken, especially on TV, right? Because these issues are treated as a one and done. So it's not that they don't get reported ever, but they get reported maybe once. And then the way the psychology of it is, the way the psychology of persuasion and changing public minds is it requires repetition, and we don't get that. So people just sort of assume the problem is gone because they haven't heard about it again. And unfortunately, that's not true. The problems just don't go away. So, there was some coverage. I think Maddow one time mentioned the disappearing Black votes in Georgia. I don't think she ever covered the ones in Tennessee. PBS, I think, is doing a little coverage on that, but it's just not enough. And it's also a transparency issue, because if the public doesn't know about it, they don't know to complain about it, and then there's no accountability. And, doing audits and things is a pain in the neck. Election officials don't want to do it. So without public pressure, it's hard to get the leverage to make the right changes.
Yeah, and we've had this discussion, me and you, all the time, but this is where you're always on Twitter saying that campaigns need to look after poll tapes. They need to understand that the election begins on election night. It ends for the voter on election night, but it begins for the candidates and the operatives and the parties on election night, because they are actively going after challenging votes. They're going after the totals, the chain of custody, all of the vulnerabilities. They happen after election night, and everybody just want to go to bed and wake up to a new winner, or hear a new winner and go to sleep. It just doesn't work that way.
Like a Big Mac.
Yeah,
I and several other people tried to get the Beto campaign to collect the poll tapes before he conceded, because there had been it was in part because of all the issues with vote flipping touch screens, although I was more concerned about the county central tabulators. Texas actually has some wireless modems as well. The law forbade it, and an article came out, again, one and done. Nobody saw it, or hardly anyone, that showed that they actually had the modems in there for like a decade. And but they didn't do it, as far as we know anyway. And I kind of gave up on getting campaigns to do it. At a certain point, you just say, we have to just do it ourselves. And that's kind of what we just started doing at protectourvotes.com and some of these other groups, because we tried. I mean, I tried to interest campaigns and parties and ACLU, and nobody, unless you study elections really carefully, you kind of accept the mantra that somebody would say something if there was really a concern. And
we have to police our republic. It's one citizen at a time. That's why I really like the CSA 2020.
Me too.
It's really documenting the record on election night. Again, these totals never get committed on election night with any granularity. You literally see two totals between two candidates, and you have no idea where they came from or if they were even the correct number.
Any quick last questions or comments from Senator Wirth or Jonathan Simon before we turn to Jonathan's presentation?
What you know about is the attention of the Biden campaign to your techniques or what you all have been doing? Do you know any of that?
Doubt it.
I don't think so. I know a lot of the, I mean, I'm hoping that some of the really nationally renowned experts are working with the Biden campaign to advise them, but they haven't told me if they are, and I do kind of know some of them fairly well. I'm in little chat rooms with them. I think they might have mentioned it if they were, but maybe they've been sworn to silence. So I hope so, but they would need a lot of volunteers out there to collect these poll tapes, and I'm not seeing that type of effort. So actually scrutineers.org is going to train poll workers to do this poll tape thing. I'm going to speak at that too later today. Scrutineers.org has to train actual people who are already poll workers and already there to photograph the poll tapes and upload them. I'm hoping to protectourvotes.com. It could be to CSA 2020. There are different groups, but wherever, I just hope they do it. And it is legal, by the way. It might sound shady, like why is nobody doing it? But the whole point of posting those tapes outside, which most places do, though not all, is for transparency. It's just nobody knows to do it. So anyway.
Yeah, I would just like to, say that this is a huge, there's a tremendous amount of inertia involved with our elections, such that we've, from a long tradition, expected them to be done a certain way, expected our roles as candidates, our roles as voters, our roles as media to be certain things. I mean, the candidate basically looks at election day as the end point of their work. They've run through their budget. They might be in debt. They're not really equipped to do recounts. They're not equipped to do legal challenges. And so they see that as the end point. The voter sees that as the end point. And the media basically says we have 6 hours to present decision 2020 to the American public. And the American public expects to go to bed knowing who the president is, who the Congress, who their leading office holders are going to be. And that has, really kind of cemented itself in place in a way that it is very, very difficult to change. And frankly, in a sense, everybody's role, we're asking it to change in the name of transparency. And, how much traction we have remains to be seen, but we've been trying for quite some time. Really, a lot of us have been trying for 20 years, and the traction has been very hard to come by.
Oh, this will be real quick, but directly to that point, I gave a talk in Florida for a Democratic, forum, and there was a member of the Florida Democratic Party there, and he was saying, "Oh, we've got all these protections. We're prepared to do this and that." And then somebody asked, "Well, what happens if vote totals are hacked?" Chirp, chirp. It was really awkward, and I was actually upset with myself because I bumped in too soon. It should have lasted a little longer even, but It was awkward. I felt bad for the guy. He finally came out and said, well, we're doing ballot images, something with ballot images. And I will say this, the Florida Democratic Party did piggyback onto Audit USA's election activists filed a lawsuit for ballot images in Florida. And they did piggyback onto that, and that's great that they did that. But they are not leading in this election security effort. It is the activists who are. And unfortunately, you know, the Republican-led administration in Florida really, they opposed the lawsuit, and they have only agreed to save the images in the event of a presidential recount, which is better than what we had, but not as good as we had hoped.
And you broke that story on Twitter, Jenny, with me and Auto USA.
Oh, that's right. I did the big press conference with you guys. That's right. But that was all that the Democratic Party then could come up with, and they were not leading that cause, and they do not think in terms of the security aspect. They're good on the suppression, and I mean, they are all over that, and thank God. But this other it's like a black hole, blind spot.
Can I ask the three of you a question? And do you think that the now increasing amount of attention being given to the need to for the networks and news media not to call elections immediately, but to be patient and wait for all the votes to come in, do you think that that's going to have an impact? Is that going to help? Will that provide the ability to go back, as in Shelby County, and really look at those tapes?
I don't think so, because again, they're not going to. If you slow down, it's so you can look at chain of custody. It's so that you can document the record. They're just going to slow down and count and make sure that they have the totals.
I don't think that they're postponing the certification deadline is the problem. That's really the certification deadlines are really what we run up against, because once it's certified, from what I know, it's extremely difficult after that. You can't really do anything.
That's right.
So I don't know that dragging out. I think there are good reasons to warn people that election night isn't the end of it. And I think that message has gotten across, and they've done a good job of that. But I don't think it affects the security of it too much.
And
it might a little bit. It might prevent some momentum for something, you know, where it becomes harder and harder to say, no, wait, look at these poll tapes. It might help a little.
Whose certification you're referring to, Jeff?
As I understand it, each state has to certify the state certifications.
Yeah,
so
we have like 21 days
the
after the election to certify the returns.
I'm sorry,
Right.
Senator. What did you say? I missed it.
Okay.
No, but it's at the end of the voting process, the certification by the state about its electors and who its electors are going to be, right? That's
Right.
what you're talking about, that certification. But in between November 3rd and that certification in December is a lot of time for counting and for verification, I would think, isn't there? Or isn't that?
I think it becomes difficult once it's certified by the state, but hopefully not. Hopefully not
Right.
impossible. I mean, we're going to keep working on it, even, you know, probably a year later. Hopefully it won't take that long, but.
Senator Worth is talking about in between. You are correct, Senator Worth. That would be the time that you would go after it. The state laws and the statutes and the people in power are going to be the ones that are running it, and that's where you get into the friction.
All right. As we turn to Jonathan Simon for his presentation, I want to once again thank Benny Smith for his presentation here. Thank you, Benny.
Thank you.
All right, Jonathan. Jonathan Simon is the author of Code Red, Computerized Elections and the War on American Democracy, Election 2020 edition, and was the executive director of the Election Defense Alliance from 2006 to 2016, and has published numerous papers on various aspects of election integrity since 2004. He's appeared in Stealing America Vote by Vote and Uncounted, The New Math of American Elections, among other documentaries. His website is codered2020.com. Dr. Simon is a graduate of Harvard College and New York University School of Law. Take it away, Jonathan Simon.
Thanks, Jeremy and Alan and No Lies Radio and the panel. We're happy to be here to talk about this. I, at least speaking for myself, am very tired. We have been through the ringer approaching this election in a way that really we have not in previous elections. As difficult as some of that work has been, and frustrating as it's been, this is a whole new experience. And I think a good part of the country is sort of sharing it with us, maybe not at this granularity or this level of detail, but certainly the level of anxiety and the level of uncertainty is just off the charts. And So we really don't know. I'm going to try to share my screen, and let's see if I can bring up my screen first. There's my screen now. I got to make it smaller so I can share it. This will be a slide oriented here. All right, share screen. Application window, application, share. Okay. How is that? Are we good? Okay. Jeremy, can you hear me?
Yes, it's looking good. You sounding good. Ready
All
to
right, I
go.
just want to make sure. Okay, so we're looking at November 3rd, and we really don't know if it's going to be an election or a coup. We have certain anxieties about what can happen. We have other anxieties about what else can happen. And as Jenny and Benny and have been discussing, we have some plans in terms of what to do about these things if they do happen. But really, there's a lot of uncertainty, and this is hard on the whole country. Now, elections. This painting from an election taking place in the 1800s, early 1800s, and they probably one time looked more like this, and no computers anywhere on this screen. But if you look at the foreground here, you can see that somebody's had their hat knocked off. They've been knocked off their chair. There's basically a fist fight taking place in front of the polling place here. And this is just to demonstrate basically that our elections have always been rough and tumble. And there was an article in today's Sunday Times by a fellow named John Grinspan, who is with the Smithsonian, that basically talks about the history of election fraud. And it was quite intense through many periods in our history. There's a quote there. It says, the radical Nebraska activist Luna Kelly wrote that until elections were cleaned up, there was very little use thinking of any other reform. James Russell Lowell warned that democracy was in more danger than it had been during the Civil War, because while Confederates seceded with half the nation, crooked politicians were, quote, filching from us the whole of our country. And this is still late 1800s. So there's a real venerable history here of attempting to steal elections in a variety of ways. Of course, back then, none of them computerized. The reason is that it's a very high value prize. It's a very high stakes. But what we came to settle into in the period that we've all been alive, living memory, is the pendulum notion. The country kind of swings like a pendulum politically, and there is an accepted ethos to this. You could govern today, or you could govern tomorrow, but not both. You'd be in office now, you'd accept the loss of that power, you'd know that you would eventually come back. And there was a certain equilibrium to that that really characterized most of the 20th century. That changed. And it changed, it's very hard to pinpoint a day, but I think you could pinpoint a decade in which that changed and became something like Vince Lombardi's famous "winning isn't everything, it's the only thing," or another football guy, Al Davis, said, "Just win, baby." And maybe sports had something to do with that change, because sports became a metaphor for politics, or perhaps politics became a metaphor for sports. And there was only one winner and one loser, and that's all that mattered. And this is what winning looked like. And the characters associated with that change One of them is Newt Gingrich with the Contract for America, and it basically became a take no prisoners approach to politics, really not thinking about decorum or sharing of power or anything like that. Really just, bury him if you could bury him and don't worry about the consequences. And the other was our old friend Karl Rove, whose motto might have been Regnum in Perpetua, which means perpetual rule. And he actually stated that, permanent Republican majority. Perpetual rule was what he was looking to institute in place of that swinging pendulum. So we wound up with a pendulum that looked like this. And the pendulum is being sort of held off to one side. It's not swinging anymore. And there's a kind of magnet in the wings there. And this magnet, of course, would be invisible in the case of computerized elections. So we're looking over the past 20 years, especially, and in spite of Barack Obama's presidency, we've looked at a veer in our politics to the right, such that America is, its leadership has been consistently to the right of public opinion on virtually every issue. And now, of course, it's going to be embedded in the court, the Supreme Court and the federal courts. There are some structural reasons for that, the Electoral College, the Senate, that give certain political advantages. But our forensics really strongly indicate that it also has to do with the corruption of our electoral process, as Jenny and Benny have been discussing in some detail. I'm giving more of an overview of the historical context of the things that they've been talking about. So in the year 2000, we saw a real strong manifestation of this. Karl Rove was involved, Roger Stone was involved, John Roberts was involved. This was in Florida, and this was the Brooks Brothers riot, which was instituted in Miami-Dade. A bunch of congressional aides were rounded up, some of them from Trent Lott's office, the majority leader, to go down and harass and intimidate the counters who were doing the recount of the vote in Florida after the election Bush had a 537 vote lead, and there was a recount that was taking place, and they went down to disrupt the recount. And this was a kind of dated back almost to the 1800s when there was this kind of violence, but we had gone a long, long time with the swinging pendulum and none of this kind of extracurricular activity. And this was a real moment of sea change in which the approach to elections, especially or almost exclusively by the forces on the right in the Republican Party and to the far right wing of the Republican Party, decided to approach our politics and our electoral politics in particular in a different way. And this was the face of it. It was really a turning point in our politics. It was, of course, led to Bush v. Gore. That's me, and I suppose happier days, although cops there don't look too happy, at oral argument at Bush v. Gore saying, trust the people. And the bottom line was they did not trust the people. They made the decision. And then to top it off, they passed the Help America Vote Act, accelerating the computerization of our elections and making the whole process even less transparent than it had started to become in the 80s and 90s. Where do we count our votes? In the partisan, proprietary pitch dark of cyberspace. I love that phrase. It pretty well sums it up. It's proprietary. You can't get a look at the code. You can't get a look at the hardware. You can't get a look at the software. It's pitch dark because nobody, no matter how many poll watchers you have, can see the process of digitized and computerized counting. And it's partisan because the outfits that were prepared to seize on this sea change and take over the counting. Outfits like Diebold and ES&S, now Dominion and ES&S, Hart Intercivic, Skytle, basically all have right-wing pedigrees, and in some cases, some pretty radical right-wing pedigrees. So you're basically asking partisans to count our votes in secret, and giving us very little recourse, very little transparency to see what actually they are doing. And obviously, you can have outside hackers as well, but and that we're mainly concerned about as a nation about outside hackers. But if you think about it, the people with keys to the front door are a hell of a lot more dangerous, and they are partisan, proprietary, secretive, and they control the cyberspace in which our elections take place, in which the votes are counted. Where should we be counting votes? Observably in public, and that can mean different things. We'd like it to mean hand-counted paper ballots, as Jenny explained. Our ballots are longer than in the countries like the Netherlands and Norway and New Zealand, where they count by hand. But we could certainly hand count the federal ballots. We can hand count the federal and statewide. Federal races, you're looking at 1, 2, or 3. That's the maximum. 3 races on any given ballot in an election year. So those certainly are comparable to parliamentary democracies like the Netherlands or Norway. And we could count those by hand in public with observers. We could certainly do rigorous audits, and that would be to some extent a substitute for the observation process. The bottom line is we don't do those things. So just give me a second here. So we have no access as citizens, and in most cases as candidates, and in most cases as election administrators, to the hardware, especially the software, the memory card, the codes, the voter marked ballots. If they are indeed hand marked ballots, at least we have a durable record. But if they're being produced by barcode ballot marking devices, which is the latest Republican rage to put them in a lot of the swing states and critical states, places like Georgia and North Carolina. In those cases, we really don't even know if the ballot reflects the voter intent. It's a bit of a complex issue. We might be able to get to it in the question and answer session. But this is part of the non-transparency. The fog of war has nothing on the fog of U.S. elections. So people like me, we gather evidence. We look at what we call the forensics. We look at exit polls. We look at tracking polls. We look at patterns. We look for red flags. That was me in 2004. There was a big uproar after the Ohio and after the Bush-Kerry election. That was down at the National Press Club, basically pointing out, what the probabilities were that the election was actually accurately counted and that Bush was the popular vote winner. And we did similar things for the states of Ohio and Florida and other states that were swing states. And people for a very brief time paid attention. But for the media and for much of the country, and certainly for the political cast, this has been an absolute third rail. The only thing I would change there is add a couple of zeros and make it 70,000 volts. It has been really omerta. You don't go there, especially post-election, with evidence that our elections have actually been stolen. Pre-election, there's some leeway. You can talk about, will your vote be counted? Are the machines trustworthy, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen that election after election, never quite as much as this year, when Donald Trump has led the charge in talking about rigged elections. It's kind of opened, ironically, it's kind of opened it up a little bit. And Sue Halpern at the New Yorker and Kim Zetter, writing for the Times and Vice, have delved in deeper than really ever in the past. And other writers too, David Scheimer with the book Rigged that Jenny mentioned, and myself with the book Code Red that Jeremy mentioned. But it's still a third rail when the election happens and you have evidence that vote tallies are looking very strange and anomalous, and there are all these disparities. The general reaction is a yawn and a shrug, maybe an eye roll. We like to believe and like to have trust in our electoral system, and as a result of that, ironically, we've come to a place where trust in the electoral system is cratering at the worst possible time among the some of the worst people that it could be happening in, because they're very low information. They're just ready to go and riot on one word from Donald Trump. So we've put ourselves in a real pickle. I want to skip over a whole career of election forensics. It's all in Code Red and on my website and in various articles. In Steve Freeman's book was the 2004 election stolen. Just want to take a quick look here at 2016 to sort of explain in the manner that Benny did, using one example, where we get our notions that elections may not have been accurately tabulated. These are the exit polls from 2016. And if you remember, they were basically dismissed out of hand. Well, they oversampled Democrats. That's the usual dismissal. There must be something wrong with the exit polls because they don't match the vote counts. And there are too many college-educated voters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What you notice here is we have the swing states, and there's some complexities with the swing state of Michigan and also Florida because they span two time zones, which really changes this, what you call the red shift, the disparity between the exit polls or any other measure other than the vote counts and the vote counts themselves. It mitigates it when they have an hour to adjust the exit polls as they do in Florida and Michigan. So you don't see them here, and you see Florida quite reduced from what it really would have been if those exit polls were posted when the polls closed in about 98% of the state. They have an hour delay, it mitigates it. But these are the typical numbers: North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, well outside the margin of error. In all these cases, decisive in the sense that as the exit polls had it tallied, Clinton won these states and would have won the election, won the Electoral College. And as the vote counts tallied, Trump won, and in some cases very, very, very narrowly. And Ohio was another state where there was actually an 8% differential. It went from basically dead even to an easy Trump win by 8%. It's not included in this chart. And you say, well, so what? So the exit polls were off. Well, they also took a national exit poll, representative of the nation as a whole, which of course includes a lot of states which were not swing states, not battleground states, not important states, states where you wouldn't expect there to be much interference or much interest in the president in changing the results of the presidential election. There'd be no point to it other than possibly padding the power, or mitigating a popular vote loss or padding a popular vote win, but nowhere near the incentive that you have in these states. And there the exit poll was accurate. It was basically right at the edge of the margin of error. Very, very different where it didn't matter and where it did matter. And that's the kind of what we call a second order comparative that we rely upon. It's very probative and really gave indications of interference in 2016, whether it was the Russians or it was domestic, or we don't know. But we do see the evidence of that interference. And I'm going to skip over this because it's just a little level of detail about the college-educated thing, but it's just take a little too long to describe it. It's all in the book. So here we are, election 2020, red, blue, black, and right in our face. Big challenges: pandemic, age of Trump, casting votes, counting votes, verifying the counts, and then the whole post-election scene. And a president who really, really, really has given every indication that he's not interested in leaving office, that it really doesn't matter what the people say, that there will be allegations. If he loses, that it's illegitimate, a very frightening situation. And this is what it's begun to look like on the streets. Real willingness to go to the mat, and the FBI warning of these extremist threats, not just to the election itself, to the possible voting process, but also post-election. We see big thumbs on the scale already. We're seeing voter suppression tactics just in some of the most critical states, where you just see these enormous lines. You see these barcode ballot marking devices, which you couldn't come up with a better way to create a bottleneck than these machines that have been put in to these states to replace the touchscreen machines in most cases. So we're seeing this. We don't know what it's going to come to, but it could be millions and millions of votes. Also mail-in ballots, the challenging of the counting of mail-in ballots, the delivery of mail-in ballots, et cetera, et cetera. Then we've got, so that was strip. We got flip. That's the part we can't see. The part we try to focus on is, from a forensic standpoint, computerized manipulation. And we got fool, disinformation. There are your votes. And there's this red carpet to enter and change. So it's on us, as Jenny pointed out, as Benny pointed out. It's going to really increase the responsibility on the part of the voter and on the part of the public in general. We had a turnout tsunami in 2018. We're seeing signs of the same thing again. This was in the increase in turnout from previous midterms. Huge, huge. Again, brought on by the age of Trump and by Trump himself. We're seeing the lines betokening that huge turnout. We're seeing what happens to people and how they get disenfranchised when the lines are that long. They give up, they go off. This is just the visible part that we can see. So I was asked to sort of predict what's going to happen in this election, who's going to win. And all I can show you is 538 is giving these odds. 538 is Nate Silver's operation. It aggregates a lot of different polls. It grades them. It assesses their reliability. In 2016, he was one of the more conservative pollsters. And this odds of the Democrats winning the Senate, 3 and 4 chance. But do not even try to count those chickens. And certainly not before they hatch. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We're looking, Jenny mentioned Rove before, and this deal, Rivada, telecommunications company, basically getting this no-bid, huge deal, $25 billion deal shoved through that Trump is pushing really hard to get through somehow before the election, breaking all sorts of protocols. Rove is the chief lobbyist for Rivada to take this 5G network and basically privatize it with bandwidth that's currently under the control of the Pentagon, Defense Department. Hugely lucrative. He's one of the investors, and he's one of the lobbyists. So Rove, our old friend, is back on the scene, sort of up there where God would be. Newt Gingrich has also lobbied for Rivada, and Peter Thiel, far right Silicon Valley guy, and major Trump supporter, is also involved with this. So the question becomes, what's going on here? Big transfer of money, right? Coincident with the election. Is it a quid pro quo? Government officials are alarmed about the White House push for this deal. Quite frankly, is it payment being funneled in some way or another to Rove for his services, extracurricular services on this election? We don't know. Again, it's just something to keep an eye on. We're looking at a lot of scenarios. I think Senator Wirth will be going into these, what can happen. The one that looks scary, one that looks most likely to me, is Trump working the processes to get the election thrown to the House, where they vote by state delegation, which would mean that Trump would win and he'd be our president for another 4 years. This is a distinct possibility. There are some others. They're all, really, really tinged with uncertainty. What are we going to do? Jenny mentioned some of the details, some of the organizations. I think those we'll probably put those up again. CSAY, 2020, et cetera, protect our votes. But, we have to recognize it's not the most coordinated, controlled response. It's not as organized as we would like it to be. It's going to be probably in a very rough and tumble situation. There's going to have to be a lot of help from the media, and we're not sure we're going to get that. We're not sure who's going to control the narrative, who's going to be in the streets, and what kind of actions we can take. I think economic actions are something that we should be prepared to consider right now. Spending strike, a general strike, really the public rising up if there are signs that the election has been illegitimate, that there are major red flags. And that's what we're going to be looking for. We're going to be looking at, if we are not entirely sure they're going to be exit polls, but we're already screen spreadsheeting the whole range of pre-election polling. We will add the exit polls if we have them. We'll look at other patterns, large versus small precincts, types of equipment, and programs like Benny's. There are going to be a lot of ways of trying to figure out if we have a problem, Houston, and where it might be and what we can do about it. And I'm going to end there. Let's hope none of this is necessary, but we really need to be prepared as a nation.
And we actually have a special guest right now. And so we will return after her presentation to have a discussion about your presentation, Jonathan. And so I would like to present Barbara Honegger. Barbara Honegger is a major contributor to the 9/11 Truth Movement for nearly 2 decades and a board member of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and is also the author of the pioneering book, October Surprise, on the theft of the 1980 presidential election by Reagan and Bush Sr., subsequently validated by formerly classified documents. Take us away for your 5 to 10 minute presentation, Barbara Honegger. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. This is a wonderful event. Thank you so much for putting it on, everybody. I've learned a lot, and I hope that what I'm about to tell you, you will also learn a lot. I want to start out by saying about the upcoming November 3rd election, don't count your chickens before they hatch, despite the predictions based upon some really good evidence that it looks like Trump will be the clear loser. When I was in high school, I learned to say it this way: never calculate your juvenile poultry before the process of incubation is thoroughly materialized. So, though I believe that Trump will lose and will lose clearly, we don't yet know, obviously. So what I want to focus on is the history of election thefts in recent American history by the Republicans against the Democrats. The October Surprise is the key example. That's the subject of my book, October Surprise. I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to give the kind of big picture to begin, because I only have a maximum of 10 minutes. And the bottom line is that, as I believe we all know, the CIA has been in the business of fixing elections and even assassinating leaders and undesirable leadership candidates in countries overseas for decades and decades. And what most people do not appreciate is that they've been doing it in the United States for a very long time as well. in terms of bringing all of that experience in fixing elections and assassinating undesirable candidates and leaders. That's been brought home to the domestic United States. The most well-known example, of course, is the assassination of RFK. I believe until right after 9/11, I believe something changed, but at least up until then, it was illegal under United States federal law for the CIA to operate in any way in the mainland United States and U.S. territories. The CIA was supposed to only operate overseas. I believe that has changed in a major way since 9/11. Maybe someone can speak to that. I've read about it, but I don't have the details here. But certainly up until 9/11, it was, at least to the public's knowledge, it was illegal under federal law for the CIA to operate in any way in the United States, but they have been, and I'm going to show that to you. I'm now going to give you the evidence in a nutshell, and I refer you to my book, October Surprise. I'll get to that in more detail in a moment. The bottom line of my findings is that all recent U.S. election thefts were by Republicans against Democrats. This is part of the way to refer to this is the so-called red shift in election interference with the voting machines, with the word red, of course, referring to the chosen color or designated color of the Republican Party and Republican voters. And of course, blue is the designated or chosen color of the Democratic Party or Democratic voters. But what about of the red, white, and blue? Who's the white? It turns out that the white is the most important of all, especially in a highly polarized Dem versus Republican, far right versus far left, or progressive versus conservative, whatever you want to call it. Our politics today are extremely polarized. But in that environment, the white voters, the swing voters, the undecideds, in particular, the independents, I'm a registered independent, are the most important voters of all. And they're the ones that the two sides fight over and play all kinds of dirty tricks to get, in legitimate as well as illegitimate ways. All right, so I'm now going to talk a bit about my book, October Surprise, Why It Matters. As it were, the mother of all recent Republican thefts of elections or massive interferences with the election results by Republicans against Democrats is the October Surprise. And in a nutshell, what was the October Surprise? It was the Republicans, the Republican Party and its leadership's treasonous interference with President Carter's ongoing and legitimate negotiations to attempt to bring our 52 American hostages home from Iran. And that interference began in a big way between the 18th and the 25th of October of 1980. That's the so-called October Surprise period. And why is that so important? Because we're in it right now. We're in it. We're coming to the end of it today, actually. What we learned inside the Reagan-Bush senior presidential campaign in 1980 through, very significant voter polls and those kinds of things, we learned that if the hostages were brought home before October 18th, that Carter would win for sure. If they were brought home after October 25th, Carter would lose for sure. Now, you can read my book, October Surprise, the first two chapters to understand why and what that was based on, but it's a fact. The critical window for doing dirty tricks is between the 18th and the 25th of October for an election that in that year happened on November 4th. Now, this year, it's very close, November 3rd. And so technically the window probably ended yesterday, but maybe for sure today for dirty tricks to be able to be pulled. All right. So that was the October Surprise. My book was the first of 4 major books on the theft or the treasonous interference with the results of the 1980 election by Bush Sr. in particular, and William Casey, who became Reagan's first CIA director. And there we have the CIA again. The actual treasonous meetings with the Khomeini representatives were by two CIA directors. Bush Sr., who was a past CIA director, after whom the CIA headquarters is named after all, and an imminently future CIA director, William Casey, once Reagan and Bush Sr. won, and I put that win in quotes. And that was, of course, William Casey, who became Reagan and Bush Sr.'s first CIA director in their first term. So there were two CIA directors who pulled off the October surprise treason with the Khomeini representatives to delay the release of the 52 hostages until after the election, and then until the moment, literally, that Reagan and Bush Sr. took their oath of office. There was a walkie-talkie on the tarmac in Tehran, and the wheels up signal was given to let the plane leave the tarmac, literally as Reagan and Bush Sr. completed their joint oaths of office that morning, literally that second. All right. So the mother of all of these October surprises was the one called The October Surprise, the subject of my book. Mine was the first of the four major books on this subject by about 3 years. The second was by Gary Sick, used the same title, which you can do. The Supreme Court has ruled that you cannot copyright titles. So he took my title. And Gary Sick published a little under 3 years later. He was Carter's chief Iran expert in the White House National Security Council throughout the entire hostage crisis. And his book basically confirms the findings of my book. The third book, and all of these four books are available still on Amazon. My book, October Surprise, Gary Sick's, S-I-C-K, book October Surprise, and Robert Perry's book, Trick or Treason, the October Surprise Mystery. Unfortunately, we've lost Robert Perry a few years ago. He's no longer with us. And Ari Ben-Menashe. Ari Ben-Menashe's book, Prophets of War, the whole first half of that book is on the inside testimony that Ari Ben-Menashe was involved on the Israeli side as a middleman for the October Surprise treason. The meetings with in Paris, France. So anyway, that's the October surprise. And I'm an expert on that. I'm not an expert on the others, but I'm going to briefly go into the other election thefts by Republicans, as far as I understand them forensically, after 1980. And then I do want to mention that after the October surprise, election theft or massive interference, knowing that by their interference that Carter would lose and they would gain the White House. The person who actually did that, besides William Casey, was George Bush, H.W. Bush Sr. And he then became vice president, not surprisingly. And then what many people don't know is that the Reagan assassination attempt, that there's a lot of evidence, and that's in the last portion of my book, October Surprise, that Bush Sr. was basically he was obviously the beneficiary, if it had been successful, of the Reagan assassination attempt. And the evidence is very strong that the October surprise by Bush Sr. and then the Reagan assassination attempt with Bush Sr. behind that, that it was a 1-2 punch to get Bush Sr. into the presidency, getting rid of Reagan more quickly than if he had to run later on his own. And that took another 8 years because Reagan did survive. I recently did a 3-hour program on a major radio show called The Other Side of Midnight. It was the October 11th program, and anybody can listen to this. The latter part of the program, about the last 45 minutes of that 3 hours, and you can move forward on the time bar at the bottom of the audio bar, is where I get into what happened on the day of the Reagan assassination attempt. I was in the West Wing of the White House, and I went on the record with truly historic information. I refer you to that. So you would go to theothersideofmidnight.com, and you'd have to sign up for their Club 19.5 to be able to listen to all 3 hours. And I highly recommend that you do so. Now, I just want to, I hope I have a little bit of time to go back to link the election theft of 2000 to 9/11 itself, to the attacks of 9/11 itself, which I know that your audience is probably very interested in. But first, I want to jump forward to, we've already heard about Karl Rove and the shenanigans with I believe it's clear, the election machines interference, stealing the vote in Ohio, which was determinative of the 2004 election. Again, that's Karl Rove and the Republicans, the Reds stealing from the Blues. I would like to point out that if, before I go back to, and then I would end with the link between 9/11, the attacks of 9/11, and the theft of the 2000 election. I'll do that at the end here. But I would like to point out that if Trump clearly loses, and it looks like with Nate Silver that he probably will, if he does clearly lose by a large margin, and it doesn't go to the House, which it then wouldn't presumably, or the Supreme Court, and if the Democrats retain the House, if all of that happens, then I just like to remind people that the newly seated House of Representatives, the new members of the House, could then impeach Trump again. And I believe they take their seats on or around the 3rd of January, and the inauguration day is until the 20th. And if this, if all of those three things do happen, I hope they do that personally. All right, now I'm just going to end. I'm going to end by going back to what my research, and I gave this presentation actually at the anniversary 9/11 conference in Washington, D.C. It was called the 9/11 Anniversary Pentagon Conference. I believe that was in 2014. And my presentation on this is on the web. But here's the gist of it. After the Bush v. Gore decision by the Supreme Court, there was something called, if I recall the name correctly, the Washington Post New York Times Consortium. They got permission to recount key votes in Florida, all of those votes. And the outcome of that recount was actually known in the immediate run-up to the 9/11 attacks. It was known by the elites of both parties, by all of the elites of the United States, and probably our Five Eyes allies plus Israel. I call that Five Eyes plus one. It was known not long before the attacks. And what happened was the attacks happened before the results were made public. And the attacks of 9/11 conveniently made Bush Jr., George H.W. Bush, into a, quote, war president, unquote, which was Bob Kerry's given reason, one of his given reasons we've already heard in this webinar, for Kerry not contesting the election in Ohio, which he absolutely should have done because we were, quote, at war in Iraq. Well, we were at war in Iraq because of the lies of who attacked America on 9/11. So what happened? As the Washington Post New York Times Consortium results, the recount, which we now know Gore won the Florida vote and therefore should have been in the White House. Just prior to the 9/11 attacks, Bush and Cheney knew that if those results came out, there would be a constitutional crisis. They had to leave office and put Gore in. Well, they weren't going to allow that. They weren't going to allow it. And the way they didn't allow it was to literally move up by about a month an emergency counterterrorism response exercise, or exercises actually, that were pre-scheduled for and were begun on the morning of 9/11 on scenarios extremely similar to, if not identical to, the actual attacks in Washington, New York City, the World Trade Center tower attacks, and in Washington, D.C., so-called select targets in Washington, D.C. That was the scenario of this so-called war game. But that war game, those are annual exercises, and they traditionally happened in October. They were moved up to September. And those emergency response counterterrorism exercises and war games were the modus operandi and the cover for the planning, execution, and cover-up of the inside job 9/11 attacks by the leading Republicans, by Bush, Jr., Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and company. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Hello?
Thank
I
you
don't-
very much, Barbara Honegger, for the presentation. Very important presentation in
Thank
terms
you.
of considering the geopolitical insertions and domestic deep politics. I have, before we turn to the panel to discuss Jonathan Simon's presentation, I'd like to bring up two references, actually, Barbara, to augment your presentation. One of them, a very current reference, is actually the book Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, which actually points out that what we're experiencing right now in terms of an October surprise was what was announced as a out of nowhere, supposedly, Arab-Israeli normalization, and the so-called peace deals that were announced between Netanyahu and the Arab neighbors, mainly UAE and Saudi Arabia. But all of this was contained in Proof of Conspiracy, as written by Abramson, and pointed to elements that were domestically involved in the Trump operation that surrounded networks such as Paul Manafort. We've already referenced that he was tied into the 2004 network surrounding election fraud. But also Arthur Finkelstein, the guru of Republican politics, really is his network mainlined Trump into the RNC. And that Arthur Finkelstein is the one who originally facilitated the rise of Netanyahu in 1996, facilitated the rise of Viktor Orban as Orban was shifting into Putin's sphere, and also facilitated the makeover of Senator Jesse Helms. Okay, so that's the contemporary reference that we're already observing in terms of geopolitical insertions as October surprises. And then one additional reference in terms of the previous October surprise is an article titled "The Real Iranian Hostage Story from the Files of Farah Mansour" by Harry Martin. And one quote, "With thousands of documents to support his position, Mansour says that the, quote, hostage crisis was a political, quote, management tool created by the pro-Bush faction of the CIA and implemented through an a priori alliance with Khomeini's Islamic fundamentalists." So that in actuality, if people want to research the deep background of even the rise of Khomeini and the generation of the hostage crisis in the first place, that then was taken advantage of, was also synthetic. So,
and then I'd just like to add one other book I forgot. If you go on Amazon, as I said, my book, October Surprise, Sixth book, October Surprise, Robert Perry's book, Trick or Treats in the October Surprise Mystery, and Ari Ben-Menashe, that's A-R-I, new word, B-E-N, new word, M-E-N-A-C-H-E, from the point of view of inside.
A-S-H-E, yeah.
Okay. From the point of view of inside the Israeli Mossad and IDF, those are all on Amazon. But if you go there and you just put in the word October Surprise, those 4 books will come up. But also what will come up is a book by, again, the title, a third one, October Surprise. And it's about how Comey's reopening of the Hillary Clinton email investigation was the October surprise that gave the 2016 election to Trump.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to the panel.
I have just a comment about Manafort. As far as I know, he was not involved in the Ohio 2004 shenanigans. I just wanted to put that out there, unless somebody else has other information. What happened is in 2007, one of his companies, some sort of digital operations company called 3EDC, listed on its website its strategic partners, and there were about 5 companies. 2 of those companies were owned, they were like one-man operations owned by the 2 guys who were involved in 2004 rerouting the results. But as far as I know, Manafort was not, had nothing to do with that. He was in Ukraine around the same time, though, with that election there. I think that's the one where there was a recording that outed electronic election theft and they had to redo it. But almost every media report I can find places him at the scene after that election in Ukraine in 2004, just in the immediate aftermath, not before. The Yanukovych, who was Putin's puppet in Ukraine at the time, who was the beneficiary of that apparent theft in Ukraine, his opponent, who he locked up, has said that Manafort was there earlier, but that's the only reference I've seen.
Thank you for that clarification,
Sure.
Jennifer. And is it the case that Mike Connell, the Rove IT guru involved in Ohio, was involved with Manafort in Ukraine specifically? Have you found any
I have not been,
follow-up to that?
sorry, I interrupted you. I have not been able to confirm that. I looked. He was certainly doing a lot of operations, pro-democracy operations in Eastern Europe. I gather there was a sort of a group of IT people doing that. Stephen Spoonamore is one of them, and he's the one who spoke with Mike Connell, who's been the most transparent about his discussions with Mike Connell, and they both were around Eastern Europe. I asked him, he could not say specifically that Connell was in Ukraine. So yeah, I don't know. But Mike Connell is the one that he owned a couple of companies, but they were basically one-man operations. And one of them was listed as strategic partners in 2007 with Paul Manafort's company. But then Connell died in that private plane crash in December 2008.
And were the RNC email servers related to the SmartTech servers that were located in Tennessee, the ones that were potentially even breached by Russian intelligence? Is that the case?
They were all related in the sense of that being the same company. So there was another guy, Jeff Averbeck, owned SmartTech, and he's still around, but I can't find anything new on him. He owned and I guess owns currently SmartTech, which hosted most of the Bush administration's emails, ironically, a private server. 20 million of them disappeared when there was an attempt to subpoena them by the Democrats, and they couldn't find them conveniently. They were discovered by the Obama administration later, which chose to keep them almost entirely private. It cut a deal. There was like a small handful. They did a random search of them and gave a little batch to, I think it was Crew that had FOIA'd them, did a public information request for them. So that was all SmartTech, Jeff Averbeck, who with Mike Connell did that. So as Mike Connell built some kind of apparatus that routed the results to Jeff Averbeck's company, SmartTech. And then Mike Connell's the one who, according to Spoonamore, was kind of a good guy that maybe got in over his head and then got worried that his work had been misused by others and was maybe going to say something about it, but we'll never know because he died in that plane crash. And just one comment, things like spying and counterintelligence, those things have to be, to an extent, done secretly. With our elections, at least as to federal and state races, they don't have to be. We don't have to use computers for this. And so I feel like we've just kicked ourselves in the faces by not demanding a lot more transparency and a lot less electronics and maybe no electronics, at least for the counting part for federal and statewide races anyway.
Jeremy, could I ask a quick question about the Ukraine?
Go for it.
Yeah. I may be misremembering this, but I believe when I was looking at Bev Harris, is it Bev Harris?
Yes.
Bev Harris's work, Black Box Voting, some years ago, that there was some kind of reference to some voting machines that are used in the United States were owned by Ukrainians. Is there anything?
I think you might be thinking of something different, which had to do with Venezuela and SmartTech and a stolen election around the same time, 2004.
It was Ukraine. It was.
I don't remember seeing that. I'll ask
maybe
her,
it's the
though.
reference to the Vicont chipset via a Belarusian to ES&S circa 2000.
That didn't come from Paris, though.
Yeah.
That was one of my colleague, Michelle, actually found.
Well, I'm not certain I saw it with Bev Harris, but it was at the time that I was watching and reading Bev Harris that I believe that I heard a reference to a company owned or controlled or on the board Ukrainians. I
think that you're thinking, it's probably that 3 EDCs, Manafort, who did the work in Ukraine, and that it was because the Free Press, the Columbus Free Press, Bob Fitrakis, made that connection that's where I saw it, between Manafort and then who was working in Ukraine, and then the people who rerouted the results in Ohio 2004. So maybe I haven't heard anything about Ukrainian voting machines.
Okay, well, Ukrainian connected voting machines used.
Okay,
I don't think so. Thank
Jeremy, can we return to Jonathan's presentation for a minute?
Go for it.
Jonathan, I had a couple of questions. One, do you know anything about the so-called undercount in Wisconsin and Michigan? That so many voters voted in the election but didn't vote for the top of the ticket. That gap being the undercount was much higher in 2016 than it had ever been before. That's a question. And then second, going to your point about counting and the legitimacy or accuracy of counting, can you comment on is there a gradation of how states do this? Are some much better than others? Is there some kind of a ranking system? Is there some way that people know if their state does a good, transparent job or not? So 2 questions. Thanks.
Yeah, those are both really good questions. I'll take the first one. First, the undercount, quite clearly is a really major red flag when you see undercounts down ballot. For down ballot races, you can kind of explain them away and say, well, the voter was kind of impatient, or maybe they had to get back to their jobs. And, again, it could be 5% of the voters, which could be enough to swing a close election. And you could come up with that explanation there, or they just really don't care about dog catcher or local officials or secretary of state of their particular state or whatever. They're not familiar with the candidates. They're low information voters. No voters are so low information or in such a rush to get back to their jobs or whatever that they're not going to vote for president. So when you see undercounts or undervotes at the top of the ticket like that, it could really be 2 things. One is a active, deliberate expression of disgust with the choices offered, but that usually is more likely to manifest in the vote for a third party candidate. Somebody like Jill Stein in that election. There were others as well, Rocky De La Fuente, and I can't remember the fellow's name now. They got about 2% or so. So that's a possibility that they just deliberately refused to cast a vote for president because they thought that Hillary was bad and Trump was worse. Possibility, but that's about it. After you get past that, it begins to look like problems with the ballot definition file, such that votes weren't picked up in some way. That you can do this with ballot definition files where you're using optical scanners. You just define the area for the vote more narrowly in certain precincts. And remember, when these machines and their memory cards are being distributed, they're earmarked. They're earmarked for specific precincts. So it's very easy to determine that you have to, this precinct has a lot of voters of color, or this precinct is a Democratic precinct. Okay, that's where we're going to create this ballot definition problem. So it's suspect. And again, the way to get at that in certain cases is to actually look at the voter marked ballots, which turns out to be fairly difficult. In a state like Wisconsin, half the ballots were recounted by just shoving them back through the machines that counted them in the first place. So there are better ways of looking at these things if you actually have hand-marked, voter-marked ballots. But that was really in such tight elections, that was a real cause for concern, and I think it was underattended to. As far as ranking the states,
just to stick with that for a second, the undercount was so much greater than it's ever been in those states in any other year before. Doesn't one also think, was there a possibility of some kind of outside interference in this, or some kind of, if it's true that the Russians were engaged in some fashion, could they have been manipulating that vote or disappearing ballots that might have been cast for Hillary?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, outsider, insider. I mean, both. Professor Plum in the pantry with the pipe. They're both possibilities that should be or should have been looked at. Presumably, DHS did a certain amount of looking, but as Jenny pointed out, they really came out with the fact that they couldn't find anything, and then there was a little fine print asterisk, and the reason they couldn't find anything is because they didn't look for it. They either weren't given permission to look for it, or they just made a command decision not to look for it, or they looked for it and found something and decided not to make their findings public. Again, this whole system, from stem to stern, has been designed for concealment, and designed to really, with the idea that the public is the enemy. The public, the ones who might actually want to know whether their individual vote has been counted, what the collective votes represent the voter intent. They're the PITAs. I mean, they're the ones that are, going to make all this trouble, and we're going to give them as little access as possible to what really should be a public trust. So yes, that was a huge problem there, and coupled with other, there are problems in other states as well, but those really stood out. And the recounts were thwarted in various ways so that they really did not shed adequate light. As far as the ranking goes, I think, informally, certain states have the reputation of being hellholes. Georgia is a classic example. Florida has won no palms. Wisconsin has won no palms. But then you get a state like Virginia that made a command decision under Terry McAuliffe in, I believe it was 2017, to ditch all their DREs. They basically followed the Netherlands and Norway, which did that in 2017. And they just got rid of their DREs, and they went to basically optical scan hand mark paper ballots. And, pretty much overnight became went from a purple shading red state to a blue state. Coincidence, who knows? What we do know is they made a big commitment to clean up their elections. So there are certain states that are moving in the right direction. There are other states like North Carolina and Florida and Georgia. A lot of them are in the South, but you can also add Wisconsin. Michigan is a scary state with their Democratic Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, who many have kind of wondered whose side she's really on here, and it doesn't seem to be on the side of transparency. There are other, there are states that are somewhere in the middle. Colorado is a good state in terms of the audits that they apply. These things are, I guess, the election integrity project, is it called? The one that's run through Harvard University in Sydney, ranked countries around the world, but it also broke down the U.S. elections by state. And so those rankings are available at their website in their archives. Verified Voting does. They don't really do rankings, but Common Cause did at one point, sort of green, yellow, and red, or some equivalent of that, pretty roughly. I think, there are certain states that are repeatedly the focal point. In presidential politics and national politics, they have an undue concentration of elections of national significance. Somebody like Karl Rove, he knows that. He has a map. He has a bunch of push pins, virtual or real. They know where they're going to go to make things happen politically, whether it's by legitimate means or illegitimate means. The bottom line, I think, to go back to something that Jenny said, is this whole thing would not be that hard to fix. This is not like putting a human being on Mars or solving the problems of climate change that require major investment, major adjustment, all sorts of complex planning. Not at all. We really could go to a pretty observable public counting process. We could bring transparency. We could get the computers, if not entirely out, we could make sure that there was adequate secondary measurements like audits, adequate backups. We could make the whole system, a hell of a lot more transparent and worthy of trust. And we've chosen not to do so. In my book, the media has enormous share in the blame for that. So did the Democrats, who had an opportunity and certainly should have looked at the tilt of the table, and they should have been incentivized to do this. And obviously the Republicans, who have basically lived, survived, prospered by election after election with red flags that are highly suspect. So there's a lot of blame to go around. It's hard to blame the individual Americans for not getting excited about this. People are busy. People have, lots of responsibilities. It's a very individualistic society to begin with. But that having been said, whether we blame them or not, the reality is it's going to be on us. We really do have to step up. We keep exhorting that to happen. Maybe an electoral crisis such as, greater than we've ever seen before will push us in that direction, or it could land us in the Fourth Reich. And that's part of why, I said at the beginning, I'm tired. It's emotional fatigue and enormous stress, because we're really looking at an uncertainty with such tremendously divergent outcomes, not just in terms of who become president or whatever, but just in terms of how we look at this whole system, how we regard our elections. Do we step up and take responsibility? And we really don't know what's going to happen.
All right. Thank you very much. And we are going to head into Senator Wirth's presentation right now. And thank you so much again, Jonathan Simon, and thank you for the seriousness at the end here, which we will then turn to in relationship to Senator Wirth. And thank you again, Barbara Honegger, for the special presentation about other forms of election interference. All right, so I'd like to introduce Timothy E. Wirth. He's a former congressman and senator from Colorado. Recently, he and a group of similarly concerned citizens have been working to shed light on the potential dangers awaiting us in the 2020 election, as discussed in his Newsweek article, How Trump Could Lose the Election and Still Remain President. With a long and distinguished political career, including over 2 decades in the U.S. House and then the U.S. Senate, he was then the national co-chair of the Clinton-Gore campaign, and from 1993 to 1997 served in the U.S. Department of State as the first Undersecretary for Global Affairs. Please take us away, Senator Timothy Wirth. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be with you all again. A lot of very, very interesting presentations. Our group began to come together about 6 months ago as we became concerned about that there were a package of authorities which the president was rumored to have, the president's emergency authorities, about which nobody really knew anything. These had been discussed a little bit in the margins of appropriation documents, but there had been no illumination of these going all the way back to the Eisenhower era. The original emergency authorities were given to the president when there was concern about nuclear warfare, what would happen, who'd be in charge, where would officials of the government go, what would a transition of the government look like, and so on. Those are, about 60 years ago, really begun under the Eisenhower administration. Those were continued and expanded during the discussions of biological warfare and chemical warfare, and additional measures were apparently added at that point to what the Pentagon might be able to do. From there, it moved into the world of terrorism and the development of apparently a number of significant what are called Presidential Emergency Action Documents, PEADS, P-E-A-D-S, were drafted. That were there various kinds of emergencies, then what would the government be able to do? And these, again, are not known, but there have been some scholarship done on them, particularly out of the Brennan Center at NYU, and that recently written up in some very good articles in the Atlantic. That's probably the best public information. So what can the president do? It's thought, and we don't know, again, because the Congress has not delved into these. The Congress will not have hearings on these, despite requests dating all the way back to the Church Committee to do so, right into our most recent discussions with the Judiciary Committee, that they hold hearings on these. The Congress has been unwilling unwilling to do so for reasons that maybe out of ignorance or whatever. But can the administration impose martial law? Can they suspend habeas corpus? Can they seize control of the internet? Can they seize property and commodities? Can they seize transportation and communications? Can they control a means of production? These are all the potential emergency documents, and many of them are referred to, again, in the margins of appropriations bills, in references, but no clear discussion anywhere as to what kind of power the president has. Now, why is this important as we think about the election? Well, you just let your mind go ahead. Let's think a little bit about the complexities of the coming election and the electoral count. Let's assume that in 4 or 5 states we continue to have a real question as to who has won the electoral votes in those states. And at the end of the week, election week, let's assume that they continue to count for a while, or let's just start on election night. That the state legislature decides that the votes cast for President Trump should be dispositive, and the electors in that state should be chosen for President Trump. The governor waits for the full count to come in until all of the votes that have come in by mail are counted, and he declares that in fact it's not that slate of electors, but it's a different slate of electors that ought to be chosen So where do we go from there? In the middle of December, the Electoral College is supposed to meet, and each state is supposed to have completed its determination as to who its electors are going to be. On the way to that point, the president might well have declared that in 2 or 3 or 4 of these states, there has been such an emergency that the votes have to stop being counted, say, on the 5th of November or the 8th of November, and that there's been a national emergency, that these have been infected by the COVID, or there have been discovered to be a stash of Chinese ballots in the closet, or whatever the determination might be, that there is therefore a state of emergency. And he's declared a number of states of emergency. One of them, but best known that we know about, is the one that he declared on the border with Mexico, a state of emergency to have money moved from out of one appropriation into another in order to build the wall. He used his emergency powers to do that. What might he be able to do to stop the count in a few key states? That would put us then into a real bind between him using the emergency powers as well as his persuasiveness with perhaps a few state legislatures to make sure that they were voting for that they were supporting his slate of electors. That then gets us to what we've talked about now a little bit today. What happens after the 3rd and the 6th of January? On the 3rd of January, the new Congress is sworn in. All 435 members of the House are sworn in again, and a third of the Senate sworn in on the 3rd of January. On the 6th of January, the House and the Senate meet together to count the electoral votes, and at that point, they will go through the alphabet, and the envelopes are opened by the presiding officer of that meeting, which is the Vice President of the United States. It would still be Pence at that point. That he'd open the envelopes, and if there are conflicts on, say, the states that we just determined there were differing slates of electors, they would go back to the Senate to have the Senate see if they can figure out what to do. And the Senate would return to its quarters, and the House would stay in the House. At that point, the Senate would clearly vote on who the slate of electors ought to be. If by the next election the Democrats have taken over control of the Senate, it's pretty clear that a majority of senators would therefore vote for the, say, let's call it this, the governor's slate of fully elected, of fully counted electors. And that we would move past that state into the next one, and all of the issues would be resolved because the Republicans wouldn't be able to take control from the Senate, in the Senate process. But if they couldn't take control in the Senate process, if the Democrats don't have a majority of votes in the United States Senate, then it goes back again to the House, and the determination gets made that both sides will try to decide what to do. Then we're into a world that we've never been in before. And under the elections law, the vote would then occur, go back to the House, the vote would then occur in the House of Representatives and voting by state. So each state would have the same vote. Wyoming has the same vote as California. So there'll be 50 votes cast in the House. When it comes back from the decision comes back from the Senate, the 50 votes cast in the House for each state. If that vote were held today, there are 26 delegations that are majority Republican, and 23 states that are majority Democrat, and one is tied. If in the election of this coming election, if the control of the state delegations in Montana or Alaska or Florida or Pennsylvania were to change from Republican to Democrat, and the current Democratic states would all remain the same, the Democrats would then have a majority when it comes back to the House, and again, it would be all over. If that doesn't occur and the Republicans still have a majority in the House, then we get into a real parliamentary tangle, and that's terra incognita. We really don't know what would happen then. You'd have the Senate determining one set of electors, the House determining a set of electors that does not reflect the full count in the country, and what would we then do? There are real questions at that point, and there's a lot of parliamentary discussion about that, and an emerging literature about what would happen then. So that's what we, among other things, have been concerned about. Our group is called Keep Our Republic. Dick Gebhardt's one of our key people, Gary Hart, a lot of former leaders from the Treasury Department and the State Department are part of our group, and written a lot about this, worked a lot about this. We have a website called keepourrepublic.com, and are live with a podcast called Unconventional Truths, and the newest edition of that is just coming out with a focus exactly on these emergency powers. So maybe that's more about a very complicated situation than you wanted to know. It's absolutely fascinating. If it weren't so incredibly important and the stakes so huge, it would be an absolutely fascinating item to spend a lot of time trying to figure out and understand and so on, which we've tried to do. Anyway, hope that's helpful, and look forward to any questions you all may have.
Thank you very much, Senator Timothy Wirth, for the presentation. I'd like to turn it directly over to the panel for some brief discussion, and then we will head to our audience questions that have been sent in. Any comments or questions from anyone on the panel?
Well, I do have one comment. It seems to me that Senator Wirth's scenarios that he played out once again illustrate the importance of not just the presidency, but of down ballot races, and the importance that we bring as much transparency, and even if it's only quasi verification, it's better than no verification as to these down ballot races. State races, state judge, I guess called judgeships, they are so incredibly important. We just can't lose track of those. And yes, there are poll tape projects will be looking at the full ballot, by the way. I don't know if everybody's will. I think they are, but ours for sure is at protectourvotes.com. We will try to shed as much light as we can on those races. But we need volunteers, a lot more volunteers, to take photos.
Yeah, I'd like to add, we've spreadsheeted those House races. As a matter of fact, more than even the ones you mentioned, because there are possibilities for in certain states. There are competitive House races that Democrats could lose and would balance out any states like Alaska or Montana, Pennsylvania, that they actually won. So again, I channel Karl Rove, where are you going to put the push pins? Which races are you going to try to affect? If you're thinking of that scenario where the election winds up in the House, we'll be looking, I think I have about 9 states, various competitive House races, and that, including some races in which the Democrats are significantly favored, but just keeping an eye on them to make sure, because that is where, kind of ancillary to the presidential states themselves, the action could be, and of course, obviously the Senate. So this election, more than most, we really are looking down the ballot. Obviously, state legislatures, as just to reinforce what Jen said, in an election that's going to determine the makeup of state legislatures for the decennial redistricting. I mean, we have enough problems with the way the Senate, the way the census was handled and the cutting short of the census. They're claiming, well, we covered 99.7% of the people, which is nonsense on stilts. I mean, in my county, they've covered, in California, my county, they've covered 71% of the people. So there's already all this monkeying with the census, which then will play out in the redistricting. So again, these are all, I had a photograph of a bunch of thumbs sitting on a scale. And really the only question is there enough room on the scale for all these thumbs that are being placed by the right, which is, demographically and politically, for many reasons, rapidly becoming a dwarfed minority, political minority in this country, and is absolutely determined to hold on to power by any means necessary. So you see things like the census, you see things like the Postal Service, being put into play. And obviously these House races and state legislative races are part of that. And they're very low-hanging fruit from an election rigor standpoint, because we have very little baseline on them. We have very little verification. There are no exit polls. Makes it very difficult to determine. And just to state the absolute obvious, a rigged election at the surface level, until you get granular, and of course, you can't get granular if you're not given certain data or information to work with. But at the surface level, a rigged election looks just like a legitimate election. You have a string of numbers, and you really can't tell much from those numbers. You could say, well, this is an unexpected result, but this country accepts unexpected results pretty much routinely. But there's going to be nothing that stands out from those numbers and says, hey, I'm rigged. It requires this digging and this forensic analysis with increasingly limited data. And that's why, the photographing of the poll tapes and such as that, the expansion of our eyeball on this is so important, because much of the data is becoming less and less available. I'm thinking specifically of exit polls. So, those races, hardly anybody pays attention to like Michigan 3 or Florida 16. That you have to be a real, political junkie to get to that level. Those are House races. Talk about, the Florida Senate or the Maryland House or whatever. At that point, at state legislative levels, it's really very hard for the public to get any handle on what's going on. Makes it very easy if you're somebody that wants to manipulate those races.
Yeah, I would just echo that piece of it. That's I'm working on a lot of initiatives now to try to go after the understanding of these House races. That's exactly what happened in Shelby County in 2008. Everybody looked up in the air at the national election. We're getting ready to elect the first black president, and then you take Tennessee, who had a Democrat legislature 100 years after Reconstruction, over 100 years after Reconstruction, and the entire state swung. And it was local. It was Tip O'Neill. The politics were local. It was about states' rights. Unfortunately, I guess I would say, I'm a Shelby County election commissioner here, and the attorney for our Shelby County Election Commission was dubbed the architect for the redistricting campaign. It was John Ryder. He was one of the top lawyers for the RNC, and he has gotten a lot of credit for redistricting. And that's the next thing that's coming down the pike, redistricting. So if nobody's willing to look at the data and see what it does, if you go to my site, my company site, www.smartsoft.llc, you can look at the October returns of early voting, and you can see and click on the districts and see what's going to be coming down the pike, because you can see what they would have to draw and where they would have to draw the line from. So I'm doing it with surgical precision. Again, I do analytics for a living. I've done this for FedEx. I've done this for ABB. So I'm actually taking a look at that, and that's where my focus is going, because they may draw me into a district. I'm actually paying attention to turnout and districts. So those down ballot races, they are critical. Even if Biden was to win the White House, but lose the state legislatures, then the governor is going to be the arbiter of any funds. The census matters. The way the districts are being drawn, and this is something that people don't realize, the way the districts are being drawn is based on gubernatorial turnout. So the funds that get routed to the local areas are based on the gubernatorial turnout. So what's happening is they are drawing those districts to make in Tennessee, Democrat districts not competitive. So what's going to happen in a race that's not competitive? You're going to have lower turnout. And in a gubernatorial race, you're going to have lower turnout, which means you're going to get less money. We have the most population in Shelby County. Shelby County is the largest county in Tennessee, but the funds don't come back here because we have lower turnout races. So it's absolutely imperative that people start, and I'm launching a bunch of initiatives aiming at 2022 to help people understand the nature of why these political races and districting matters and why the census matters.
Is it unique to Tennessee that the governor draws the districts, or is that true everywhere?
Absolutely not. It's local governments. It'd be your county commission, the equivalent. We have a county. We don't have a metro government in Shelby County, but it's our local county commissioners. They work to draw the districts, and the thing about it that makes it partisan is because it's whoever controls the legislature locally are the people who conduct all of the redistricting effort.
I just want to comment, the picture that Benny 2 hours ago painted in his presentation of Shelby County is really, really chilling, because, it basically showed that as the election administration changed, so did the results of elections. It's causality. It could be correlation and not causality, but it has a causal look to it. We saw the same thing in Virginia. Well, you take Shelby County and, you multiply it by 3,144, when there are approximately 3,144 counties in this country. If that kind of stuff is going on in even a relatively small fraction of those counties, take a place like Mecklenburg or Philadelphia County, you could give it Dane County, Waukesha County in Wisconsin, we know some of the hot spots, but it just implies, just how much cancer there could be in this country. It's again, the Shelby County thing it's almost like a pathologist's report. They got a slide. Benny examined the cell and said, "Oh my God, it's malignant." That tells you something about what could be going on in the rest of the body. And, this could be the state of our country, that this kind of, whether it's by insiders, whether it's by administrators, whether it's by outside hackers or whatever, if Shelby County is indicative, and there are a few other counties that you could say the same thing where we know there's bad things going on, then we're in real trouble. And it could go a long way to explain why there's this tremendous, veering in this dichotomy in this country between what the majority seems to want and what we get out of our political process.
Yeah, I would. You're right on it. I mean, that's the silent killer. Like, a lot of people didn't realize that the courts were being packed at the appellate level, right? There were judges that were slated to be appointed here. They all were withdrawn. And what's going to happen is if you have a Democrat presidency, then you'll have all of these fights at the local level. Well, they may pass at the local court, but it's going to get kicked back at the appellate level.
All right. Any last comments here before we move to questions from our audience?
Let me just say we've heard a lot about how complicated and difficult and so on this is, but not to be put a Panglossian sheen on it, it's amazing that it works at all. In such a massively decentralized system run predominantly by volunteers with a few part-time workers working with very, very low budgets. It's quite remarkable that we're able to survive every 2 years or 4 years, isn't it? I mean, any comments on that? Or
yeah,
pure sweat equity.
Yeah, sweat equity. We want our democracy on the cheap. I mean, we spent $1 trillion bringing democracy, the air quotes, to Iraq and Afghanistan. $6 trillion, and we want our democracy on the cheap. We don't want to spend anything. When it comes up to hire more staff or to make the wages competitive, or have outreach for volunteers or anything like that, we don't have money. The money isn't there. We just, as a nation, are not willing to treat our democracy as if it was worth this kind of expenditure, and we pretty much getting what we paid for.
Well, assuming we get through November and successfully get through the 20th of January, is there a well-known agenda of reform elements that you all think, there's a consensus agenda that goes quite rapidly into the thinking of the Biden people?
Senator Ron Wyden came the closest to writing legislation that would have been somewhat meaningful. It actually required not dog and pony show manual audits, but risk limiting audits for every federal race. And it banned these barcode touchscreen machines that Jonathan touched on. And it also banned internet connectivity for voting equipment. It did not address electronic poll books, but I think it would be a really good place to start. There is a problem, though, which is that because people are so concerned for a variety of reasons about acknowledging all of these vulnerabilities, that it's very difficult to get traction and a consensus on the vulnerabilities that's needed to actually get legislation passed. And so, I mean, not that many Democrats even signed the SAFE Act, which is the bill I'm referring to, in the Senate. It passed the House, but the Democrats really didn't. And in terms of getting through this election, I just want to say we really, because people don't discuss vulnerabilities enough, it's been impossible to get groups like the ACLU, or even the NAACP has expressed some interest, but it hasn't come through yet, to getting some of these large organizations that already have large groups of volunteers to help with things like photographing precinct results and comparing them to reported results. And it has become less transparent. Pennsylvania, I'm told by an election judge there, for the first time, is not requiring that they post their poll tapes this year. And when you don't have, so we're going to have to get them through public information requests, and we'll need volunteers to help send those out to every single county. But when you don't have transparency, you're vulnerable on both sides. You're vulnerable whether you win or lose, because especially if you have a tyrant in power, you can't, if he claims it's rigged and it wasn't, you have trouble disproving what he says. And if he were to steal it, you have trouble proving that too. And so we just, for this election, really poll tapes and a number of other projects are really important. Transparency should be the word, I think, for all of us.
All right. Thank you very much for the conversation. And thank you very much again, Senator Timothy Worth, for the presentation that sparked it. And I'd like now, in our final segment here, to turn to questions that we received from the audience. And I'm hoping that we can keep our answers fairly brief. Some of them are not, don't need lots of extensive comment, but some might. So I'm also going to paste them into our presenter chat so that they can see them if they want to respond to individuals' email. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to begin reading out the questions here. I don't know if that didn't work, but I'll figure that out. I'll repost them in the chat so they can be seen. But question number 1 from Lindsay V. Is anyone pushing Edison Research exit polls to not take them down and force them to conform to the actual vote?
Jonathan, that's you.
That sounds like the answer.
Yeah, we don't even know if they're going to put them up in the first place, let alone not take them down. Nobody forced, pressures Edison to do anything really, except maybe the media consortium that is their chief client base. No, I mean they're going to adjust them. That's why we're going to be there on election night, screen capturing them as soon as they're posted, if we have exit polls. So we're gonna snag them. Then we have them, and we have them archived, and it really doesn't matter if they change them after that. That's been the game since 2004, and we're going to keep playing it. We just hope that we have something. And then, of course, there are these damn 2 time zone states. I don't mean to damn the states, but it's a problem. Florida and Michigan are examples of that, where the delay and presidential years in the first public posting of the exit poll is an hour. And with computerized counting, by the time an hour goes by, they've counted, in an ordinary election, 60% of the votes or so. So those very first postings that we screen captured have already been adjusted in states like that. And some of those are very important states like Michigan and Florida. So we got a lot of problems and a lot of potential, pitfalls as far as the exit polls go. All we can do is, we're going to have our eyes on it. We're going to do our best to capture the data.
Okay, very good. And I'm going to paste the questions as they come in here, or maybe Alan has just asked me not to because it's too confusing. So I'll just ask them verbally. The next question is from Lauren Giles Johnson to Jennifer. Has Jennifer been on the Rachel Maddow show or shared her concerns with Rachel?
No, I have not been on the Rachel Maddow show. I started writing to ask Rachel, or whatever that thing is, a long time ago, and didn't get any response. I had flagged her many times, and at a certain point I got the bright idea when Georgia was about to choose these new touchscreen voting machines, QR code machines that experts were all recommending against, and the non-experts in Georgia seemed determined to buy them. I became very agitated, and it occurred to me, or somebody suggested I tag her producers instead, because they don't have such a large following, they'd be more likely to see it. Well, I did that, and they ignored it, and then when I got irritated and said something like, dear so-and-so, it would be really nice if you would at least pay attention to, I got blocked. So at least I knew they'd seen it. And then there was kind of a big kerfuffle, and they, my followers follow this issue they've seen me sort of learn as I've learned information, they've learned it, and they were horrified for me. And he did unblock me and even follow me, but he went completely dark. Like, he won't respond to direct messages or anything. And Georgia went ahead and bought the machines, and there was no TV coverage of the concerns that, I wanted to get ahead of it. No one liked to try to fix something after the fact. We had an opportunity to get ahead of these problems when it was really almost unanimous. Anyway, the answer is no.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, next question is also for you, Jennifer, from Ruth Strauss. In terms of your need for people facile with computers and software, et cetera, do you need those people locally for races, or can they do their work remotely in another state?
I'm not sure, really. I would actually ask if you could just volunteer on our website, protectourvotes.com, and put in what your special expertise is. And I think they may need some help at this nvrtf.org monitoring the results and getting the URLs into their system. I don't know how much tech support we need for our project. I do. If there's still time to sign up as poll workers, people with tech abilities who can work at the polls are very much needed in case things go wrong, which they probably will in some places.
Thank you. And here is a suggestion, I think, from Missy, who says the people who conduct exit poll interviews ask voters who they voted for. However, I think it would be more useful if they asked the voter how they voted, i.e., did they vote by regular or provisional ballot? This may yield more accurate data.
Marilyn Marks at the Coalition for Good Governance has started doing surveys to voters about how they voted. And I think that maybe some people are doing it nationally. I don't know. I haven't heard of it. I think it's really important. It doesn't work. Well, at least not doing it in person won't work for people who vote by mail, though. But I think yeah, you're right. Those are really good questions to ask.
Yeah, I mean, exit polls in general obviously have more difficulty this time around because of all the remote voting, or they're not going to be there on election day to be asked. And then there are COVID issues in terms of approaching people or people being willing to even, be approached to take a questionnaire. So they got a lot of problems to worry about. I would not be surprised if they do ask, if there are exit polls and they are, following through with it, that they do ask how you voted, because that is going to be a big issue for them. The problem with asking whether you voted by getting an answer that I voted provisionally is that you really don't know whether that vote is counted. You may at some point, could be counted, it could not be counted. You may at some point get a percentage of provisional ballots that were counted from the county or from the state. But by that point, it's probably, from a timeline standpoint, it's past when the exit polls sort of have their unadjusted utility, which is immediately upon poll closing. So in a sense, they just have to do some sort of estimate of the likelihood that provisional ballot was counted. So I think that's one reason why they really haven't emphasized that in the past. I mean, the exit polls are not a simple who'd you vote for thing. I mean, there's the short form and the long form, and the long form runs to sometimes 40 or 50 questions. When did you vote, and breaking everything down by demographics. When did you change? If you changed your mind, when did you change? When did you make up your mind? All those kind of questions. Approval questions. How do you think so-and-so is handling this or that issue? So there's a lot of information that comes out of exit polls. And they certainly could very easily include a question of how you voted.
Okay, here is a macro question from Marilyn Langlois or Langlois. I'm sorry if I got your name mispronounced there. Don't we need to look deeper at the context that tends to encourage vote rigging in our cutthroat capitalist system in which money rules and obscene wealth disparities with widespread poverty persists? People on top get away with cheating all the time, cheating in business, cheating in the stock market, cheating on taxes, and yes, cheating on elections. Cheating for material gain is a bipartisan enterprise. What can be done about this deeper context? Anyone want to answer?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this in my discussion. Like we have to change the narrative. It's not voter fraud; it's election fraud. The incentive to cheat in a race will happen with a candidate or an official. I think in far more a magnitude that can actually decide an election outcome than an individual voter. So we do have to start raising the ante on correcting the narrative, because if you hear it discussed, it's always voter fraud. You always hear something that is about as random as barely germane to the topic most of the times.
Okay, thank you. And up next here is for Jonathan from Ruth Strauss. With barcodes or QR codes in my state, how do you figure out voter intent? Or is it impossible? How do you know intent if a recount needs to be done?
All right, that's probably more in Jenny's wheelhouse, but I'll take a stab and then just correct me if I'm wrong. It really varies, because the nature of barcodes really vary in terms of what kind of summary sheet they give you, how legible it is, Even factors like how long you have to look at it. If you've just stood on a 6-hour line and there are people stamping their feet behind you, you're going to be less likely to go down your whole ballot and see, does this, is this the person I voted for? Is that the person I voted for? Is this race missing? So there are lots of opportunities. And then you have machines that are hybrid machines that actually create and print out the ballot. And put it through the scanner, and those are, I think, been dubbed permission to cheat machines. They basically make the voter play first. You have to commit to either reviewing or waiving your right to review the ballot before it goes back through the print heads and gets the information printed on it. So the computer knows, and computers know. This is not high-level intelligence. It knows whether you're going to review or whether you've waived that right. So it opens up the possibility for absolutely risk-free fraud in terms of putting down a choice that you didn't make, reversing your choice, eliminating your choice, whatever they want to do, because you've already committed to not reviewing the ballot, and it goes through that process accordingly. So there are lots of different problems. I think Jenny had a pretty famous barcode, and underneath it says, is this Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And of course, you can't tell on a barcode or a QR code. Our brains aren't set up to read them. And even in a lot of cases, barcode scanners will not read them because they're proprietary. So you have your work cut out for you. There usually is something in English. Whether that something in English corresponds to what's on the barcode, you just have to have your thoughts and prayers out. And if there is a recount, I think in certain states, Jenny may know more about this, but in certain states, they're not going to look at what's printed on the card, even if it's in English and it says Joe Biden. If that barcode says Donald Trump, that's what gets recounted. So there are major problems with barcode. Ballot marking devices, I like to say that an able voter needs a ballot marking device like a fish needs a bicycle. I mean, these came on, they've been pushed very hard by the vendors and by the Republicans in particular, and really a solution, without a problem.
And I'd just add, so the barcodes and QR codes, with the exception, I think, of Los Angeles County, maybe, but maybe even there too, they're proprietary. So there isn't a way to use an app or anything to decode them. And plus, in many jurisdictions, and I think most, you're not allowed to use your cell phone inside a voting booth anyway. So there is no way to know what the barcode says for the individual voter. That is absolutely faith-based, and that is the only part of the printout from these machines that's counted as your vote. In almost every instance that I know of, they do have human readable text beneath the barcode that is supposed to summarize your selections. Studies have long showed that most voters don't review these printouts, and this is the part that's conceptually very difficult, I think, for people to accept, is that even when they try, they have a very hard time remembering their selections. And a visual really helps the best, but when we have these really long ballots, especially down ballot, if the printout, for example, doesn't even if it's a summary printout, which almost all of these are, meaning it says like Congressional District 3, and then it'll say, Jerry Winehouse. If it doesn't even put the D or the R next to it, most voters have not memorized Jerry Winehouse's name. And so there was a recent study by the University of Michigan that showed that 93% of machine-caused inaccuracies on these printouts, flips, vote, changing it to the other candidate or deleting the race entirely, go unmissed by voters. And perhaps even more important is even when voters notice a problem, they can't prove that that they hit the wrong button or that they just missed that race on the touch screen. So it actually is really a perfect storm for fraud as to down ballot races. And what that study concluded is that the only thing that really improved significantly that ability to detect machine-caused problems on these printouts that are then used to count you can use the text in an audit, at least in theory, or a recount, at least in theory. The only thing that helped voters to detect problems in the text was if they brought a pre-filled slate or pre-filled sample ballot. And I've been messaging, do not use touchscreens if you can avoid it. If you use a touchscreen, use your sample ballot to compare against the printout. It makes me very it's very discouraging that the proponents of these systems, they know full well what this study said, and they are not out there warning voters to verify their printouts using a sample ballot. They are completely silent, and everyone should be messaging, bring your sample ballot. It helps for hand-marked paper ballots too. It makes the whole thing faster and better.
And if I could just attack it technically, you cannot know what's behind the barcode. I write code, and barcodes are for the manageability of inventory. If you buy a gallon of milk, in California from Turner, it will cost differently from the same barcode scanner. Jonathan, you do books. You got an ISBN, you got a code, right? That code, you can make a sale whenever you want to, and you can reduce the value of those decimal places. Yeah, I see where I'm going with that. But the other piece of it is because it prints out a summary, that's a dangerous element. In a candidate race where there are 10 names, would you know if I showed you 7? You would not. And if it's with a hand-marked paper ballot, who you chose and what your choices were are enshrined into the record. And with a ballot marking device, only the choice that you made, everything else that happened in the history of what you did is left in the machine, and it's gone after that, and it's not evidence anymore. We don't want any confidence. We need some evidence.
Oh, and I want to just one other
Jeremy,
thing. A lot of early voting is BMDs.
Jeremy, I have to drop off now.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Senator.
Senator.
Appreciate. Good to be with you.
Good
Good luck to
Senator.
everybody.
Do you want to
Get
give
some
us
sleep
any
on- sleep in
final
November.
any
Thank
closing
you.
statements?
No, I'm all set.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
So just quickly, a lot of early voting is on these touch screens. So I don't want to discourage early voting by any means, but I would just please, if you vote in person, whether it's early or election day, get your completed sample ballot. Almost everywhere has it, not everywhere. County election website, you should be able to find it. If not there, I believe ballotpedia.org, and bring it with you and use it. Don't fool yourself that you're one of the people who would notice if, Jeremy Hinderbaum was changed to Cindy something another. You probably wouldn't notice.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to add, a lot of people have asked, well, how should I vote? Or how should we vote? And, it may be obvious to us, but I mean, we're still getting asked the question. There's no one size fits all here. It really, really varies from state to state, county to county, possibly even zip code to zip code. And so we try to encourage people to make the phone call, do the research, call their county elections office, find out, for instance, if I vote early, will I be obligated to vote on a barcode device? If I go to the polls, on election day and do in-person voting on election day, will I have a choice? Will I be allowed to fill out a hand-counted, hand-marked, voter-marked, hand-marked paper ballot? Or will I be forced onto one of those barcode machines, et cetera, et cetera? It's getting late in the process for mail-in voting, but there were other questions where you're basically weighing, okay, what are the dangers of, what's the booby traps voting this way? What are the booby traps voting that way? And because it's such a non-uniform system, it's such a mosaic, and because it's such a different, really an extraordinary election, both in terms of the stakes and in terms of the mechanics because of COVID, and these literally, coming out every day court decisions that may determine how you can vote or what votes are more likely to be counted. It's really on us as individual voters. We really have to do the research, find out. There may be some groups that can help us with this. There was the 2020 voters calendar, which has some good information about deadlines and such. But really, don't be shy and don't be lazy. Make that call your county, and find out what the story is for specifically where you are. And yes, and she's showing it. It's not very visible, but it's, what is it? 10
My tip card.
Yeah, it's a card. It's a cheat card. Now you can get that through her on Twitter, right?
It's on Twitter. ProtectOurVotes.com has it. TheBradBlog.com just put it on his website. And I believe when the link goes out for this, I also sent it to Alan Reese. and he flashed it briefly, one with the blue outline on it. It walks people through a lot of this stuff, so it is complicated. It walks it through. It says, use a hand-marked paper ballot if you can, call your county and ask. If you can't, vote by mail. If you do use a touch screen, bring your sample ballot. So it kind of walks you through step by step, and I think it makes it a lot easier.
There it is.
There it is.
Nice.
It's great, Jenny, and you still may have to make that phone call to find out what's going on.
Which it says on here, yes. It tells you when, though, to have to make the phone call.
And just to make one other very general point, I mean, we've seen, most of us probably watching here have seen the lines. I mean, they've seen the impediments, they've seen the suppression schemes, and it's just, it bears emphasis that this is not what it should take to participate in the democracy. I mean, obvious hurdles, making it more difficult to cast a vote. I mean, people who spent literally 11 hours online. Now, we fight, or in the past, we've gone to war for our country. We've certainly done things that are a lot harder than spending 11 hours online. So somewhere between this idea that it should all be done for us and we should just walk in and walk out and never have to worry about anything, which is way too lazy, and this wait online for 11 hours and maybe your kid's at home setting fire to the couch, or you're about to get fired from your job, or it's pouring rain and you're going to get pneumonia and then get COVID complications. That's too hard. And what's really outrageous about it is that is hard deliberately to strip down the electorate and make it so that we cannot participate. That is absolutely inimical to democracy. That's outrageous. And yet it's happening. And we're kind of, we're protesting against it. We're also kind of saying, well, that's the way the game is played. And it shouldn't be. And I mean, one would hope, I mean, if and this is a very partisan thing because it's the Republicans who are constantly trying to strip down the electorate and limit the franchise to the wealthy and the homeowners and the people who live in places where you can just walk in and vote and walk out, where they have more machines than they need. This is ugly. This is profoundly ugly and outrageous. One would hope that if there is a change in leadership at either a state level, county level, national level, that one of the first things we'd act on is a repassage of the Voting Rights Act, state legislation of a similar nature, and regulations and administrative work to make sure this never, never, never happens again.
All right. A few more questions. I just want to also announce that producer Alan Reese says that the link to Jennifer's tip page will be linked on the web stream page within an hour after this event is over.
Great.
And so next question is from Steve Black. Is it possible for Trump, Barr, Wolf, Rove to steal more than about 3 battleground states? I'm worried about Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, maybe Arizona, but how many can they realistically steal? If Biden-Harris win Arizona, North Carolina, plus Georgia or Ohio or Texas, then it would be hard for Trump to reach 270 electoral college votes. Thanks.
All elections can be stolen.
Right.
We don't have any way of knowing how sophisticated their ground operation is. I've been really worried about the internet connectivity in some of these swing states of their county tabulators and precinct scanners on election night. They're connecting them to the internet, but even without that, they can, and that just seems unnecessary. Like it's just a weird, like rolling out the red carpet, which is partly why election security experts are so up in arms about these. That's Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida. I think Texas has them, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota. It's not every state by any means. So if you're talking about internet hackers, there is that. Even without that, internet hackers could, in theory, get in through the election management systems used to program the voting machines before every election, because apparently many of them can and often do connect to the internet, or they received updates from internet connected systems. We have to be on guard on it in every state, but obviously the bigger the operation, the harder it is to pull off.
Yeah, the infrastructure, you can look at who's governor, who's Secretary of State, and down the list. So the incentive of some insider, not to say that the officials are bad people, but there could be bad actors. So the persons that are in power would have the incentive to remain in power. So they would probably be doing something for their party. So that would be Democrats or Republicans. You can look at all those places, and if the swing states, I called Michigan in 2016 for Trump, and everybody asked me why. They said never went. I was like, it's a Republican governor there. That's what I looked at.
I'm going to do it.
All right. Next question is from Jonathan. Is there any evidence that the Democratic leadership and or individual candidate campaigns are prepared and planning to verify after the election that A, mail-in ballots were cast, received, and votes counted properly with the data confirming those processes available to the public, and B, in-person voting systems, ballot accounting, and vote counting processes are confirmed with verifiable data, which is publicly accessible and traceable?
I would say not in a consolidated, really easy to access kind of a way. I'm sure that, I'm sure they're going to, they are doing a good job, I think, doing what they can, the Democratic Party doing what they can with mail voting and attempts to suppress mail voting. Transparency, I don't think most people think of our elections in terms of transparency, and it just doesn't dawn on them in the US. Other countries, yes. In the US, we just don't, no one talks about it that way. So I doubt there is an effort to be super transparent about whatever they find, whether it's for mail voting or electronic voting. I am very skeptical that they are doing much to try to confirm electronic totals. There's not much we can do without those manual audits other than the things that we have discussed today, like poll tape reviews and things. And I don't think they're doing those.
Yeah, most governments, they operate in the so you got to get on time machine and go back 20, 30 years. The processes and policies and procedures, these local governments, right? They, in many places, they're the largest employers. But the way I'm sitting on a commission and I ask for like a standard operating procedure, and I look like I'm a giraffe. It's just not something that they do. Government they don't have to be transparent as much as a publicly traded company or something. So it's a very different animal. So the very likelihood of them covering something up is not necessarily that they want to do something bad. It's just they don't want to have to deal with it. So they can just say, oh, well, let's, for consistency's sake, say that it's all right. It didn't determine anything. And there's your gaping hole.
Well, and they're also worried, I think, when people report problems, if it ends up being nothing, they don't want to be accused of, causing
Right.
undue panic. But frankly, I don't think as long as you put plenty of caveats with it that we're investigating, I don't think personally, I don't think it causes panic. I think people get more panicked when they feel like they're not being let in on whatever is happening with the election system.
Yeah, I mean, it is a system designed for concealment, and it's not just a system the way a desk is a desk. I mean, the system consists of the human actors who are part of that system and have bought into that system. And, we would love to think that out there somewhere right now, there's some, bold and deeply concerned administrators who are, looking at a memory card, consulting with a cyber expert. Are our machines, are they okay? What does this memory card look like to you? The odds, though, that that's happening are very small. And I think that, we've been led down the road before to believe that, John Kerry raised $15 million to raise legal challenges, specifically for legal challenges in the event of a stolen election. And then, it was staring him right in the face. I mean, there were all these things, and there was none of that money was spent. We went into some of his reasons for being very cautious there, or just rolling over. But I mean, who knows what the Biden campaign or the Democrats are going to do? I mean, you can paint all these various scenarios. And if, on the evening of November 3rd, you get this, well, Judy, those Hunter Biden tapes really played well, it appears, with the suburban housewives tonight because Trump has taken, blah, 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 Florida and Pennsylvania, where we didn't really expect him to do that well, and blah, blah, blah. And that's the media narrative. And they have some implausible, but just barely plausible, explanation for it. I mean, it would not shock me to see Biden out there conceding by 11 o'clock. We've seen so much of that. We would hope that there would be a mindset that says, wait a minute, the Democrats, part of the problem, and Jenny kind of alluded to this, but it bears emphasizing, the Democrats have painted them, and the media have painted themselves into a corner because Trump, idiot savant that he is, came out and basically said, this election is going to be rigged. I'm not going to accept the loss, blah, 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 blah. There's voter fraud. There's all this mail-in ballots and the Chinese and all this stuff. And as a reflex and an understandable reaction, the media and the Democrats circled the wagons and said, wait a minute, our elections are legitimate. You can't question the results of any elections. You just got to accept the peaceful transfer of power. So we've been set up for a situation where, God forbid, the Democrats lose and Biden loses. They're already basically on record as saying, well, we can't challenge the legitimacy of elections. It's really scary because they're these it's a two-headed monster. And, one is, and I think Senator Worth got at this, one is that there is this, victory for the Democrats and for Biden, and Trump has telegraphed basically that he's not going to accept it, and he starts screaming mail fraud and throwing it into the courts, many of which at the appellate level are his appointees, and delaying things long enough to throw everything to the House, where presumably they'd still have a majority and Trump wins. Or the flip side of that is that there's this shocking Trump win, because right now, based on everything organic that we know, there's no freaking way he can win this election. I mean, Nate Silver gives him a 1 in 10 chance, which is, that's scary enough for people who have had enough of Donald Trump and this whole, fugue that America is going through. But really, I mean, it really would require cheating. So he's going to win with a combination of suppression, disinformation, vote count manipulation, whatever that witch's brew is, and then you're there. You are on election night, and all of a sudden Donald Trump is the winner, and you're the ones that have to come out and say, "Wait a minute, this election was illegitimate." That's going to be really tough, just like it was for Kerry in 2004. So, I mean,
is there any evidence though? Is there any evidence that the Democratic leadership or specific campaigns are planning, or they have plans to verify the election processes, or no?
Not the voting machines. I will say this: Hillary did fall for that scenario that Jonathan described in 2016, where she basically conceded in advance. She said she would accept the results. I'll accept the results. Will you accept the results, Donald Trump? And I'm sure at the time that made sense because everyone thought she was going to win. Seemed really obvious. She actually came out and told Biden, and it was reported in the news, that he should not concede if it's close. If it's a close outcome, that he should not concede. And I think that is admirable on her part, the ability to actually learn from, his troubling history. So I don't think Biden has locked himself in a corner as badly as occurred in 2016, at least. But I also think that Democrats sometimes do this weird balancing where they worry that if they look under that rock, it'll make things worse. So in North Carolina, it's my understanding that they did not want to make an issue of the malfunctioning electronic poll books there, even though it was extremely suspicious and it was VR systems, which there had already been reports that they'd been breached by Russia, but the Democrats didn't want to go there because they had managed to win the governorship. And you can kind of understand that, but then we never got answers.
How are you? Oh, sorry, go for it, Benny.
I think that highlights the conundrum. You have to look at who is in power in which state, right? It's not just Republicans, it's Democrats too.
Yeah, I
there was
would
a
not
large,
put them in the same. I'm sorry,
right.
go ahead.
There was a large group of people who were for Bernie that thought that somebody was doing something against Bernie and the party. That's the conundrum. We need an authenticatable result, right? The people who voted for Trump are going to demand evidence that he loses in the same equal weight as everybody who demands that Biden has evidence that he lost, or vice versa. It doesn't matter what you put on the other side of the equal sign. There is going to be a side who is going to lose, and they're going to want evidence and proof
Exactly.
that they can accept the returns, right? It doesn't matter which candidate you pick them as a winner or a loser. The argument is exactly the same, and that's the conundrum.
All right.
Yeah, I have a really great quote from Dwight Shulman, who works for the Secretary of State of Colorado. And there have been a bunch of conversations about transparency going back and forth on Twitter. And he said, "I've been privileged to work under 4 secretaries of state from different points on the political spectrum, all of whom were/are exactingly honest. But in my opinion, evidence and transparency yield public confidence in elections and outcomes. Honesty and integrity no longer suffice." So, I mean, it doesn't even matter if you need to have that transparency and that evidence so that
Right.
the supporters of the losing party feel comfortable with the outcome
Right.
as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
how are y'all feeling about? Can you go on a little bit longer? We have a few more questions. How are y'all doing for time?
And both me and Jenny have a hard stop here in probably about 10 minutes.
All right.
Yeah, that's
We
great.
headline on another show.
All right. Let's get you all out
We're
of here.
booked.
Okay, let's jam through this. Has there been any talk in the actual Congress and the Democratic leadership about looking into the investigating the election for legitimacy and credibility, or no?
Not that I've heard of.
All right.
Well, the House Intelligence Committee did produce a report that came out and with a bunch of redactions, and then repeated the mantra that there was no evidence that vote tallies were altered. And that's where Senator Ron Wyden wrote his dissent, which the media ignored, but he correctly noted that there was no forensic analysis, and we didn't get the recount was blocked by the Trump administration for the most part, and that there was apparently, as far as we can tell, no factual basis to say that vote tallies weren't changed. So to say no evidence that vote tallies were changed really there shouldn't be a lot of weight given to that.
All right. Well, I want to just, in closing here, I want to say that it's been an honor and privilege to be your moderator today. And I want to thank Jennifer Cohn, Benny Smith, and Jonathan Simon for their time and their energy in terms of presentations today, but also in a bigger fashion about being truly patriotic Americans in the best sense of that word, and in an even deeper fashion committed to putting their energy towards truth and justice as humans. And so obviously there's a consensus that the next week and a half is just the beginning of what's likely what we're up against potentially in terms of the controversies of the election. Remember that it also speaks to the Supreme Court. And as was alluded to before, there's a solid caucus inside of the Supreme Court of justices, even the Chief Justice who were involved in the 2000 decision, Bush v. Gore. And the third one's on her way in there, it looks like, Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh, and John Roberts. And so I just want to thank all of our speakers today. I'm Jeremy Roth-Kushel. I also want to thank Alan Rees from No Lies Radio. And Alan has said that there's going to be a follow-up in the weeks after the November 3rd election to look for that in your email. And so I want to give anybody who wants one last chance at a brief word. Jonathan.
Okay. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of stuff we didn't cover. I think for this whole country, or for anybody who really believes in and wants to see our democracy continue, this is a real testing period. It's like Heartbreak Hill in the Boston Marathon. We're tired. There's a lot of anxiety. It's really time to dig down, and we're going to have to individually and collectively step up, depending on the circumstances, maybe in different ways, but really be guardians of what we have come to take for granted, but what we really should be valuing. in our country and in our democracy.
Thank you.
3 words: transparency. Oops, 4 words: transparency, down ballot races. We've got to watch all of those.
Yeah, I would say we have to police our republic. All of us, we have to demand that the public part of this process, casting the ballot is a secret process, but counting it is a public process. We need to demand accountability. We can measure it and track it. The public has the right, and we need to assert that right.
All right. Well, thank you all very much again. And thank you to Alan Rees at No Lies Radio. And thank you very much to our audience who have been with us today and submitted their questions. I apologize if we didn't get to your questions, and we will work to make sure that all of the questions are directly submitted to the panelists. And so in conclusion, I would hope that we understand that we are in play here, and truth, justice, peace, freedom. Our people are starved of knowledge. Our intention is to feed them in order to go onwards and to make of this country and this world of what we can do with it. So the knowledge is the beginning. We need to stay aware and focused on and be cool under pressure. And last thing I would say, be prepared for the question of direct action. Be prepared to gather with neighbors, to gather at state capitals, to gather at national capitals. And I thank you all very much for your time and your energy. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Jeremy.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you again.
Bye, guys.
All right. Good to see y'all.